Chapter 45. In the corner of the inn. A fat man sitting in the shadows whispered a few words to a waiter. The waiter nodded and came to the bar. "Marauder wants to talk to you." The man in front of the bar frowned and nodded. "I'll be there in a moment." He waved his hand and arranged for one of his men to sit in front of the bar. Then he walked to the shadows and sat down. "Marauder, you old fox. Don't tell me you're interested in that girl?" The fat man poured himself a glass of wine and looked up at him. Although his face was full of fat, his movements were not as slow as his appearance suggested. "Kofan. That little girl just now was not bad. Many nobles like this kind of style recently. If you catch her, I'm sure I can sell her for this price." The fat marauder raised 5 fingers and said slowly, 500 Kindler coins. "I'm sure a lot of nobles with special interests would be willing to pay this price for a pretty girl like her." Kofan frowned. He looked at the fat man and said in a deep voice, "You know what? You're breaking my rules. I won't do this in my own inn." The fat man smiled and shrugged. He moved his head closer and said, "You've sold hundreds of women to me. Don't tell me your basement is clean. It's up to you whether you want to do this or not. I'm sure you can get rid of that girl quickly. A lot of nobles like her." Kofan seemed to hesitate. He lowered his voice and said, "That guy isn't easy to deal with. He seems to be a rogue. He's very vigilant. I can't let anyone die in my inn. Otherwise the security team will come after me." The fat man in the corner smiled strangely and said in a low voice, "We don't have to worry about anyone dying. We're just merchants, not killers, right? I have a potion I bought from a wizard. You just have to put it on a towel and cover your nose and mouth. It'll make you lose the ability to resist. When that guy leaves, you can arrange for someone to go in and take the girl away with a sack. He's just an outsider. He can't do anything here. If necessary, we can—" Marauder made a throat-slitting gesture and said in a low voice, 500 Kindler coins isn't a small sum. I knew you had plans to stop. After this, you can buy a small manor." Kofan was silent for a moment, then gritted his teeth and said, "Fine. But I need your men to do it. The price has to be raised to 600 Kindler. Based on my experience over the years, that little girl is definitely of the highest quality. When she grows up, she will definitely be a great beauty." Marauder hesitated for a moment before extending his hand. "You really are a greedy old dog. Deal. I'll give you the money after the goods are sold. Don't worry, such good goods are very popular with the nobles." Kofan stretched out his hand and said in a deep voice, "All right." The big man got up from the table and gave a look to the thug next to him. Then he entered the kitchen at the back. A tall and skinny man turned around and whispered to Marauder, "Boss, I'm not sure what to do next. Is it really worth it to make a move here for a little girl? The Whiterun guards have been very strict recently. Besides, 600 Kindler coins is too high a price. From what I can see, she can't be worth more than 200 Kindler coins." "What do you know?" Marauder frowned and looked at him. "That little girl is a bit special. How could she be sold to those old dogs? I know some people who are willing to pay a high price for this kind of special goods." The tall, thin man shuddered when he heard this. Then he remembered some bad memories. Naturally, not all of the women and children who were abducted from the slums of the old city were sold to the nobles of Whiterun or sold as slaves. There were other creatures who were willing to pay a high price for goods from them, especially pure virgins and those with special bloodlines. People who wandered in the gray area would always have dealings with the Umbral realm. Some of the creatures hiding in the human society had always been the biggest customers of human trafficking. It was already an unspoken rule of the Umbral realm to not attack ordinary people. Many special creatures had secretly made connections with human trafficking. As long as the transaction was completed, there would be no trouble. If the goods that were sold accidentally died, there would naturally be buyers who would take care of them. Marauder frowned and looked at the man next to him. "How are you going to make a lot of money with me if you're so timid? We'll leave after this. The situation is getting more and more unstable. Do it when you have the chance." Second floor in a room. Soren put Vivian down and looked around the room. He took out some things from his multidimensional bag and squatted in front of Vivian. "There are all kinds of people here. Be careful when I go out." Soren took out a dagger and handed it to the little girl. "Do you still remember what I taught you?" Vivian gently nodded her little head and reached out to take the dagger. She whispered, "I remember. Don't worry, big brother." Soren hesitated for a moment, but he was still worried. Vivian was born with over 20 points of charisma, and people with high charisma tended to attract a lot of attention. It would be fine if she was an adult who could protect herself, but she was only an 8-year-old girl. It was too easy for people to covet her. This was especially true for human trafficking. Human trafficking in every city was an important source of income for the Umbral realm. Nobles, prostitutes, black market slaves, and even vampires. As a rogue, Soren knew all too well what the Umbral realm did, so he always tried to keep Vivian in his line of sight. He was very wary of this world. Perhaps it was because he had been exposed to too much of the dark side as a rogue. He always felt that the people he met were from the Umbral realm. This was a very dark and chaotic era. The law was often just a decoration. What restricted people's behavior was more of a belief and morality. These two things were the most difficult to determine. Soren wanted to go to the Adventurers Guild to inquire about the news and see if he could find someone to go with him. He now had some kindler in his hands. He might need to go to some special places to meet some people and buy some prohibited weapons from them at a high price. The journey to Autumnfall was not peaceful. At this time, it was not convenient to bring Vivian with him, but Soren was not at ease if he did not bring her along. Big brother. Vivian reached out her small hand and held Soren's hand. As if she knew that he was a little worried, she whispered, "When you go out, I'll stay in the room alone. I promise I won't run around." Soren hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, "Okay. I'll go out and inquire about the situation and see if there's any other way to leave. You stay in the room and don't run around. I'll be back in half a day at most. I'll find a place to stay tomorrow." As Soren's figure left, the two people in the inn immediately looked at each other. The fat marauder winked at the thin man next to him and handed him a bottle of potion. "Be quick." He whispered to the thin man, "I'll go to the back and help you. Once you get it, go to the same place. I'll find a way to contact the buyer." "Will Cowan be angry if we do it now?" the thin man asked. Marauder glared at him and said in a low voice, "That old dog is willing to sell his own sister for money. As long as we get the money, who cares?" Inside the room, Vivian was playing with a dagger out of boredom. If Soren were here, he would definitely be surprised. The little girl was able to play with the dagger like a flower. It was exactly how he used to train his fingers when he was bored. "I really want to grow up faster." The little girl tilted her head and spun the dagger in her hand. Because of her small hand, the difficulty was even higher than Soren's. Although she wasn't as fast as Soren, she didn't make any mistakes. If she made a mistake, she would cut her fingers. Clang, clang. Someone knocked on the door. The little girl stood up and hid the dagger behind her back. She shouted, "Who is it?" "A waiter from the inn." A man's voice came from outside the door. "The boss asked me to bring up the food." "Food?" The little girl was confused and muttered, "They give out free food here?" Most inns only provided accommodation. The food had to be bought from the bar in front. Vivian held the dagger in her small hand and opened the door with a frown. She looked outside. Sure enough, there was a tall and thin man carrying food. There was also a towel beside him. The little girl couldn't help but sigh in relief. She leaned to the side and hid the dagger. She said softly, "Please put it on the table." The tall and thin man looked around the room and couldn't help but smile. He quickly entered the room and closed the door. Then he picked up the towel beside him and rushed towards Vivian. In an instant, the little girl bent over to dodge. Just as the tall and thin man rushed in and closed the door, she felt that something was wrong. When the tall and thin man picked up the towel to cover her mouth and nose, Vivian instantly took out the dagger. She raised a finger and uttered a strange syllable. Then a strong light exploded in the room. Blood splattered everywhere. The tall and thin man in front of her lost his target. When he bent over, the little girl waved the dagger and slashed his right eye. One of his eyes was destroyed on the spot. There was a suppressed scream. The tall and thin man covered his eye with his hand and suddenly grabbed at the little girl. Although Vivian had already dodged, she was too small and too slow. After using all her strength to swing the dagger, she couldn't dodge in time. Lightning shock. The tall and thin man who had already grabbed the little girl and was about to choke her suddenly trembled. An arc of electricity jumped on Vivian's fingertips. The tall and thin man's whole body twitched as if he had epilepsy. His grip on the little girl's arm loosened weakly. There was a flash of cold light. Vivian instantly used the dagger to stab the tall and thin man's left eye. The tall and thin man's whole body stiffened and then he became motionless. The little girl's face showed a trace of horror. She looked at the blood on her hand and the dagger fell to the ground. But she quickly took a deep breath and then reached out to pick up the dagger. She quietly glanced outside. After making sure that no one else was disturbed, she immediately picked up the things and ran out of the room. In front of the hotel lobby, the little girl suddenly stopped. Then she turned around and slipped into the backyard. She went out through a small dog hole. Ignoring the mud all over her body, Vivian got out of the dog hole and sprinted outside. Chapter 46. The Adventurers Guild. When Soren entered, the guild was already bustling with activity. Many merchants had gathered here, and they were planning to gather their reputations and work together to break through the encirclement. If the road continued to be blocked, the goods in their hands would rot here, and some of the goods would be lost if they missed the deadline. If the road was blocked for a month or two, they might not even be able to return to their homes. Many places would be covered in snow during winter, and it would be impossible to cross the encirclement. The roads in this world were still primitive. Even if there were human activities, they would still be blocked by the snow and ice of winter. In his previous life, snowstorms were rare due to global warming, but in this primitive world, winter was the time when human activity was rare. Even in the south, the snow could reach up to 20 centimeters thick. With such a thickness, a person's foot would reach their knees, and it would be impossible for carriages and horses to pass through. Knowledge Geography. The B-rank quest reward was still on the bulletin board. Although Soren wanted to accept the quest and tell them the reason behind it, he knew that he was not strong enough to take the reward. Leaving aside the question of how he could prove that he knew there was an ancient red dragon in the encirclement. Even if they believed him, the suspicion they would have was enough to cause unnecessary trouble. The Adventurers Guild would not easily believe that a mere Tier 2 rogue could obtain such important information. With his strength, he could not even break through the encirclement of monsters outside the encirclement. This kind of quest required a rough record of the completion of the quest. Soren did not even know the geography of the encirclement, so how could he make up a flawless lie? The merchants were still arguing. They wanted to work together to hire more manpower, but they also wanted to ask the higher-ranked merchants to send an army to Whiterun to clear the encirclement. The monsters that were expelled from their original encirclement had taken over many places, cutting off the trade routes and cutting off the supplies to Whiterun. Incompetent nobles. Soren turned around and glanced at the young merchant who was complaining. He then walked out of the guild. For now, these people could not come up with a viable solution. Now it was up to Whiterun to deal with the situation. In every city there were places that could not see the light of day. These places had inconspicuous signs, and if one was not familiar with the gray area, it would be difficult to find the dark corners of these alleys. Soren walked through the dirty alleys, and the air was filled with the smell of urine. Even a place like Whiterun could not avoid the filth and stench. Many residents poured their chamber pots out of their windows onto the streets. In other words, if one was not careful early in the morning, they would be drenched in urine. Soon, Soren arrived in front of an iron gate. There was a cross of swords in front of the gate, and a snake was engraved underneath. Clank. He knocked on the door and the door frame opened. The guard looked at him coldly and asked in a deep voice, "Who is it?" "Is everywhere." Soren rin. As the heavy door opened quickly. The guard glanced behind him and invited him in. The space inside was very spacious and there were a lot of weapons. However, most of them were ordinary equipment including prohibited crossbows. Many of the lethal items were prohibited items and military weapons. They could not be bought from regular weapon shops. Soren wanted to buy more than these, so he had to go through the gray area. "What do you want?" A man with a cold expression walked out. Soren looked at him, then looked around and said, "Venom. The venom of a wyvern. And a crossbow. The bolts must be poisoned as well." The man stared at him, then turned around and sat on a chair. He crossed his legs and said, "These things are not cheap. Did you bring enough money?" Soren took out a heavy money bag and said, 120 Kindler coins. "I want undiluted venom. Don't try to fool me with defective products." This was a lesson learned from experience. He had bought many diluted venoms in the past. Deal. The gloomy man pondered for a moment, then opened the drawer and took out a thumb-sized bottle. He threw it directly into Soren's hand and said in a deep voice, "If you're not afraid of death, check it yourself." Soren caught it, uncorked it and smelled it. He then quickly closed it and threw the money bag in his hand over. The venom of the wyvern. It was the strongest poison that could be obtained through conventional means. It was also the most commonly used poison by assassins. Poison was not as simple as rubbing it on. Many poisons would quickly evaporate after coming into contact with air. Wyvern venom was one of the most stable. It could maintain its toxicity for a day or two when rubbed on a weapon. To deal with more troublesome enemies, thieves had to rely on other means. "Follow me." The man took the money bag and counted it. He then gave a look and said, "The weapon you want is behind." The man quickly took out a strong crossbow. There were also 30 dark green bolts. These bolts were soaked in venom when they were made. The poison had already seeped into them. They were more deadly to ordinary people, but they could also deal a lot of damage to professions. Regular weapons shops could only buy ordinary equipment. This kind of thing could not be obtained through conventional means. 30 Kindler. The man threw the crossbow over to check the goods and said, "Is there anything else you need? There are still many good things in my shop." Soren took the crossbow and assembled it. He then put it away and said, "Do you have any alchemy products?" The man's expression stiffened. He paused for a moment and said, "Those things will cause trouble if they get out. The city guards will conduct a large-scale search without waiting for the church to make a move." The control of alchemy weapons was very strict. Soren was not surprised. He paid for the crossbow and said, "I'll take these." When Soren left, the guard on the side glanced at him and came over to say, "Boss, I'm sorry. What's the background of that guy?" "We're just doing business. I don't care where he's from." The man played with a kindler in his hand and said in a deep voice, "Maybe he's from the Mask of Shadows or maybe he's from the Dark Brotherhood. None of those rogues know their place." After buying what he wanted, Soren rushed to the inn. But before he got close he felt that something was wrong. There were a lot of Whiterun city guards nearby. He covered his weapon with his clothes and quickly ran to the inn where he was staying. There were a lot of people around him and some of them looked unfriendly. Something happened. Soren's face instantly turned ugly. He put his hand on his curved sword and released a murderous aura. But someone suddenly pulled him back. The person looked familiar. He should be one of the guards. He came over to Soren and hurriedly said, "Vivian is fine. The little girl is very smart. She came to us after the incident. She's now at the caravan's residence. The master sent me to find you." Soren breathed a sigh of relief. He looked around with some lingering fear, frowned, and stared at the inn owner who was explaining to the Whiterun guards in the distance. He then turned around and left with the caravan guard. He would deal with this matter when he came back. The most important thing now was to make sure Vivian was safe. Soren walked very fast. The caravan guard had no choice but to trot to keep up. The two soon arrived at the caravan station in Whiterun City. Because the northern witches were quite powerful, they had their own independent courtyard and shops close to the bustling area. The guard captain nodded when he saw Soren. The two had become closer after selling the Ankheg shells. If Soren was not in a hurry to leave, the guard captain would have invited Soren for a drink. After all, the 1,500 Kindler made them a lot of money. "The master is inside." The guard captain pointed at the room behind him and said, "The little girl is very smart. She couldn't find you after the incident at the inn, so she followed the original path to find us. I didn't expect an 8-year-old girl to have such a good memory. I've been here a few times but sometimes I don't know the way. She's in the master's room. We can't go in. Be careful. The master doesn't seem to be in a good mood today." Soren nodded to express his gratitude. He then took a deep breath, opened the door and walked in. "Big brother." Vivian, who was sitting on a chair, saw Soren and immediately ran to him. Soren reached out and hugged her. He patted her back gently and said, "It's okay. I'm back. Tell me what happened." The little girl had changed into a clean set of clothes. The white dress on her made her look like a little princess. The mysterious mistress of the caravan was sitting on a deck chair in the room. When she saw Soren, she frowned and said, "Vivian knows magic. Why didn't you tell me? Do you know how many problems a natural warlock will encounter? They're different from the rest, and they're destined to attract a lot of trouble before they grow up. If it's someone with good intentions, it's fine. But if it's someone with evil intentions, Vivian will become their easy target." Soren was stunned. Although the mistress of the caravan spoke in a harsh tone, her words still surprised Soren. Her attitude told him that she cared about Vivian's safety. They had known each other for less than 5 days, and they had only traveled together. They didn't really talk much. The mistress of the caravan's reaction could only mean that she really liked Vivian, or that she was so good at acting that she could even fool herself. The little girl seemed to be able to get close to others easily, as long as they didn't have any bad intentions. For example, the priestess and the northern witch in front of him. "I'm sorry." Soren didn't know why he was apologizing, but he still put Vivian down and bowed. "We didn't want to attract unnecessary trouble, so we didn't tell you that Vivian can cast spells. After all, we can't be sure who's trustworthy. I owe you one this time." Warlock, profession information. Warlocks are born with the ability to cast spells. They begin to display their primitive magic during puberty. Their first spells may be cast accidentally, and they may not be able to control them. Sometimes, It can even lead to dangerous situations. A young warlock's house is often filled with strange sounds and lights, and it looks like a haunted place. However, one day the warlock will understand their own unique power and begin to practice and improve their spellcasting skills. A few lucky young warlocks can be taught by older warlocks how to use their innate power. However, it's more common for young warlocks to live a lonely life due to fear from their friends and misunderstandings from their family. Because of their natural charm, warlocks often leave a strong impression on others, which helps them to communicate with others. But sometimes, because of her appearance, she would attract unnecessary trouble. Female sorcerer. Before they grow up, warlocks will encounter many problems due to their unique characteristics. Chapter 47. The mistress's expression softened a little. She waved at Vivian and the little girl walked over obediently. It seemed that she was much closer to Vivian because of her help this time. Go to the main hall first. The mistress patted Vivian's head and said softly, I have something to talk to your brother about. Vivian turned around and looked at Soren. She only left after he nodded at her. Soren. The mistress watched as Vivian left. After she left, she said in a serious tone, I want to know about your past. Did anything special happen? Vivian's talent is extraordinary. She awakened her magic at such a young age. Her future achievements are immeasurable. Sauron looked at her, shook his head gently and said slowly, I'm sorry. There's nothing special that I need to tell you. Vivian and I were orphans when we were young. Our lives were no different from those of the poor. Orphans? The mistress's expression softened a little. There's no way that nothing happened. When a sorcerer awakens their magic for the first time, they usually go through a lot of emotional turmoil. Something special must have happened to awaken Vivian's power. Solon was a little stunned when he heard this and then asked, Something special? I once met a sorcerer during a mission. I was severely injured and was bedridden for half a month. Maybe I'm not fated to die yet. The mistress looked at him and muttered to herself, Is that so? She cares a lot about you. If you are seriously injured and your life is in danger, it is very likely that she will awaken her hidden power. Vivian is still too young. As she gradually grows up, her power will become stronger and stronger. If she doesn't know how to control this power, it is very likely that she will harm others or even cause great destruction. You're not a sorcerer, so you can't understand her talent. She's a spellcasting genius. Even my mother isn't as talented as her. Spellcasting genius? When Soren heard these words, he suddenly trembled and thought to himself, could it be that Vivian has the talent of spellcasting genius? It was the most powerful talent that spellcasters could have. If Soren remembered correctly, anyone with the spellcasting genius ability could get a +2 spellcasting power bonus for any spell, and at the same time the casting time of any spell could be shortened by 1 second. That was to say, any spell that took less than 1 second to cast could be instantly cast by people with this ability. Even a level 0 spell has a casting time of more than 1 second. Soren seemed to have thought of something, and some images flashed through his mind. But Vivian seems to have activated it after chanting the spell. It seems like the spell is really instantaneous. A level 0 spell's incantation was very short. It only had 1 or 2 syllables and it took less than 1 second to finish chanting. If one didn't have a special spellcasting talent, they would need to gather elemental energy. Soren didn't know much about spells, so he couldn't tell if the spell was instantaneous or not. However, the northern witch in front of him could definitely tell. In other words, the spellcasting genius Vivian might really have a talent called spellcasting genius. This talent was a special ability that couldn't be mastered through training. Spellcasters of any profession could increase their spellcasting power by 1 point per profession level. With 10 points as the standard, every 2 points in the main attribute would increase their spellcasting power by 1 point. In other words, if a level 5 sorcerer had 16 points of intelligence, the spellcasting power would be increased by 5 plus 16 to 10, 2 is equal to 8. The so-called spellcasting power was actually a measurement passed down from the arcane era. For example, the level 0 spell Lightning Shock could only produce 3 points of electric energy. However, if the level 5 sorcerer above cast it, the power of the electric arc could reach 11 points. If this power of electric arc was used on an ordinary person, it would be fatal because ordinary people only had around 10 points of HP. However, if it was used on a profession, it would inevitably be resisted by the vitality of the profession, and the damage would only be around 5 to 8 points. In addition to the strong vitality of professions, it would only cause light electric shock damage. It It was like an ordinary person touching a high-voltage electric current. The following was Vivian's ability. If she really had a talent called spellcasting genius, then when she cast the level 0 spell Lightning Shock, the power of the gathered lightning would be increased by 1 plus 2 plus 21 to 10, 2 is equal to 8, 5. The power of the spell would be a little stronger than a level 5 sorcerer, and this was only because she was only a level 1 sorcerer. As her profession level increased in the future, this difference would become bigger and bigger, especially after she learned spells like Finger of Death, that directly relied on the opponent's vitality to determine whether or not it would directly kill. Many sorcerers' spells did not directly cause damage, such as Web, Charm Person, Control, and so on. The success of these spells depended on the sorcerer's spellcasting power and the will of the target. Under normal circumstances, a legendary sorcerer's spellcasting power would only be around 30 points. 20 points of profession level would give the spellcasting power, 8 points of intelligence would give the spellcasting power, and some special talents would give the spellcasting power. If there was a legendary equipment, the spellcasting power could be increased by 1 to 3 points. This was why the spellcasting genius ability surprised Soren so much. Not to mention, if Vivian mastered the spellcasting proficiency ability in the future, she would be able to increase her spellcasting time by another second. At that time, she would be able to cast any spell that took less than 2 seconds. There was a brief moment of silence. The mistress glanced at Soren and continued, "Before you came, I performed a divination ritual for Vivian, and I saw something bad." Divination? Was it a branch of prophecy? It seemed to be an ability of the northern witches, and it was said that they could vaguely predict a person's future. However, it was impossible to say exactly how clear the prophecy was because even a legendary-level prophecy could only see a fragment of the future. It was a very short scene, and the moment the prophecy was completed, it would start to deviate. The further the time period was, the greater the deviation of the prophecy. Prophecy spells were mainly used to predict the future, allowing the caster to avoid dangerous situations or places in advance. This was the reason why the Northern Witch suddenly left Amber City in advance. When she performed the divination, she sensed that something dangerous was about to happen in Amber City, and it was something that she could not change even with her current power. Soren took a deep breath and slowly asked, "What did you see?" "Blood and fire," the mistress said solemnly. She took a deep look at Soren and said with a serious expression, "Prophecies can only predict the future from fragments and images. Blood represents slaughter and death, which means that Vivian will be surrounded by death in the future. Fire represents war and destruction, which means that she will experience many destructive things in the future. I don't know what's so special about her, but the trajectory of fate has already determined that she will not be an ordinary person in the future." According to the Northern Witch's divination, only a small number of people would see such a scene. Some of them would become kings, some would become evil tyrants, and some would become legends. Regardless of whether they were evil or righteous, their lives would be filled with slaughter and death. The mistress took a deep breath and said slowly, "Vivian's future is destined to be turbulent, and you won't be able to protect her forever. Forgive me for being blunt, but you seem to be afraid of something. I don't know what you're afraid of, but I can feel that you're running away from any possible danger. That includes me. Maybe that's why you can't trust me." Silence. Soren fell silent. "Afraid? Maybe I'm really afraid. It's because I care so much about her that I'm afraid of losing her. Running away? Am I really running away?" Soren knew all too well how many terrible things would happen in the upcoming year of troubles. The gods and demons tore apart the sky and the earth. In this unprecedented catastrophe, even legendary professions could be wiped out like chickens and dogs. He was only a Tier 2 rogue. Shouldn't he be running away from all of this? It was a war between gods. Even a legendary-level professional only had the qualification to enter the arena. There were as many saints as dogs and liches were everywhere. He didn't even have the right to fight with them. Was he supposed to just sit there and wait for destruction to come? He wouldn't even know where his enemy was when death came. What if he hadn't left? Would they have been wiped out like ants by the meteor burst that destroyed Amber City? The woman in front of him didn't know. She didn't know what was about to happen or what kind of terrible disaster it would cause. This was because even legendary witches could not foresee the coming age of turmoil. Mortals were powerless in front of gods. Millions of players couldn't stop the year of troubles, so how could he change it all by himself? What else could he do other than run away and wait for the right time to accumulate strength? Yes. Soren slowly raised his head and looked at the mistress in front of him. "I'm afraid and running away from some things. Some things can't be changed by human strength. I don't trust you either. You seem to like Vivian a lot, but you're acting all high and mighty. I may be weak now, but I won't be weak forever. I know what you're trying to say. I'll never let Vivian leave my side. I'll protect her with my life, but you can't. You care more about Vivian's talent. If she doesn't have it, she'll just be an ordinary girl to you. But it's different for me. Whether or not Vivian has talent, she's the closest person to me. She's the only family I have left in this world. You said that I still can't trust you. Yes. Because you haven't even told me your name. Maybe you don't think I deserve to know your name, and you only want to keep her by your side because you're curious. I'm very grateful to you for bringing us all the way to Whiterun, and I'm even more grateful for your help today. I'll find a way to repay you in the future. You're a kind and benevolent witch. Otherwise, you wouldn't have needed to say so much to me. A simple charm spell would have been enough to solve the problem. I'm very grateful to you. Soren bowed deeply and walked out the door. Wait. The mistress stood up and stared at Soren. She sighed when she saw the determination in his eyes. She knew that there were some things that the man in front of her would protect with his life. This was the reason why she noticed Vivian's talent in the first place. It was a sincere and distant feeling. She slowly walked in front of Soren. She looked at the weak but determined man in front of her. For the first time in her life, she felt that he was qualified to speak to her as an equal. It wasn't because of his strength, but because he cared so much about the little girl. The mistress of the caravan sighed. Magic can't solve all problems. Overusing your power will only make you lose your way. My name is Gloria. Maybe you can let her stay by my side for a while and learn some useful magic knowledge. It'll be helpful for her in the future. She reached out her hand. For the first time, the mistress spoke to him as an equal. Her name was Gloria. She was a powerful northern witch. The man in front of her, who she could easily kill, had won her respect with his firm beliefs and sincere feelings. Chapter 48. Evening. Soren left the caravan alone. Gloria was right. He did not have the ability to guide Vivian's path. Unless he planned to become a wizard, Vivian would have to learn all the spells on her own. She would have to take a lot of detours, and sometimes it could even cause destruction and danger. To some extent, this was what a talented sorcerer had to face. Therefore, Soren decided to let Vivian stay by his side for a while. He would not let Gloria take Vivian away, but since they were trapped in Whiterun, it would be better for Vivian to stay by his side for the time being. Moreover, Soren was ready to take this opportunity to go out and take a risk. When he walked out of the room, the little girl's eyes were red. Perhaps she had eavesdropped on their conversation, but she reached out her small hands and tightly grabbed onto Soren's clothes. Her pitiful appearance made Soren's heart ache, but it also made him more determined to go out and take a risk. Time waits for no man. If he slowly leveled up like before, it would be very difficult for him to protect himself before the time of troubles. Therefore, Soren had to go out and take a risk because there was a chance in front of him. Although the ancient red dragon had not yet appeared, the chain reaction caused by its appearance had already begun to ferment. In the past, he would still have to search for monsters in the wild, but now, all the monsters around the Black Swamp had been driven out by the dragon's aura. In other words, Soren did not need to go deep into the wilderness. He could encounter a lot of monsters in just a few days. If he was lucky and didn't encounter anything dangerous, he could even get close to 1,000 slaughter EXP a day by hunting monsters. It would take at least a week for the trade route to Whiterun to open. As long as Soren was not unlucky enough to die in the hands of monsters, he could level up to grade 3 in a week's time. Food, weapons, bandages, potions, insect repellent, antidotes. Soren's figure was busy in the trading area. After such a long time, his savings were quickly spent until there was no more space in the multidimensional bag. Only then did he stop his crazy purchases. The night was hazy. Soren's silhouette reappeared near the inn. He already knew what had happened from Vivian. Naturally, he wouldn't let them go so easily. Since they dared to do certain things, they had to pay the price. In a dark alley. The security in Whiterun had been getting worse and worse recently, and the number of guards patrolling the streets had increased by a lot. At the same time, someone had proposed to impose a curfew, but it had not been approved yet. The hotel seemed a little deserted. Because a person had died during the day, most of the guests had checked out. There was a lamp on the bar in front. The innkeeper, Cowan, sat at the front with a gloomy face. He looked at the fat man in front of him and said, "Marauder, is that all you've got?" He actually sent a subordinate who can't even handle an 8-year-old girl. "Are you out of your mind?" Marauder's expression froze. "How is that possible?" he growled. Lasker's skills are not inferior to those guards. How could he not even be able to handle a little girl? There's something fishy about this. Maybe someone else did it secretly. Not only did they steal our business, but they also killed my subordinate. In fact, he had another guess in his mind. That was, his subordinate had really failed. Not only did he fail to kidnap the little girl, but he was also killed by her. But this kind of thing was too absurd. How could a little girl who looked at most 7 or 8 years old kill a man who had undergone specialized combat training and was an advanced class holder? Suddenly there was a slight noise. Marauder raised his head cautiously and signaled to the thugs beside him. As a human trafficker who lived in the slums, his alertness had always been very high. Boss, not good. The warehouse is on fire. One of his subordinates quickly ran over. The back of the hotel had caught on fire at some point. The fire spread quickly and almost reached the kitchen at the back. Cowan, who was in front of the counter, stood up angrily and yelled at his subordinate, "Bastard! Hurry up and put out the fire." The dozen or so people in the inn started to get busy. This kind of inn had its own well and water tank. The others quickly took out things to put out the fire. However, Marauder, who was sitting in front of the counter, had a slight change in his expression. He quietly looked around, and his fat body immediately ran away at a speed that did not match his size. Based on his intuition, he felt that the fire was too sudden. Maybe someone was planning to attack them. Moreover, the young man who went out during the day had not returned. Maybe he was the one who started the fire. The fat figure quietly slipped out of the side door. Marauder put his hand on the hilt of his sword and looked around vigilantly. Then he ran towards the street outside. Swoosh! A crossbow bolt shot out from the darkness. Marauder's fat body trembled, and he let out a painful cry. Rumble. There was a loud explosion in the distance. The wine barrels in the inn's warehouse were set on fire. Explosions occurred one after another. The sound of the explosion spread quickly and alerted the nearby patrolling guards. Swoosh! A second crossbow bolt shot out from above. Marauder was already on guard, so the bolt only grazed the side of his face. It was only then that he realized that the enemy was on the roof of a building beside the street. The explosion just now covered his scream. After realizing that the enemy had a crossbow, Marauder immediately rolled down the building and pulled out his weapon. The speed of a crossbow bolt was very slow, but the interval between the two bolts was less than 2 seconds. This meant that the enemy was an experienced crossbow user. He did not have any armor on him, so there was no way he could block the bolt with his body. Marauder opened his mouth to call for help, but gradually, a numbing sensation spread from his wound to his entire body. His body became stiffer and stiffer, and in the end he fell to the ground. Poison. The venom of a wyvern. Marauder's years of experience in the Grey Realm made him realize something. Despair immediately appeared on his face. A black shadow jumped down from the second floor. A cold light flashed. A scimitar sliced through his neck and decapitated him on the spot. Soren's masked figure appeared. He coldly looked at the corpse in front of him, bent his body and jumped up from the wall to the second floor. The Whiterun guards would arrive in 10 minutes at most, and he had to kill all of them within 5 minutes to escape. Since the fire was already spreading, there was a possibility that the wizards and priests would be alerted. In this era, most houses were made of wood. Once a fire started, it would be difficult to extinguish it with water. Sometimes it would even burn down an entire street. A row of data appeared in front of Soren's eyes. Target eliminated. Extracting soul energy from target. Received 180 slaughter EXP. Under the shadow of the night, a vigorous figure leaped across the rooftops. Soren quickly approached the inn and reloaded his crossbow. He only had a few seconds to shoot. In other words, he had to kill as many enemies as possible before the others heard the screams and reacted to the situation. Because even under the cover of the night, these experienced gang members could still react to the fact that someone was attacking them with a long-range weapon in a few seconds. Once they hid behind an object, half of the crossbow in Soren's hands would be useless. The arrows were all coated with venom beforehand. Soren crawled on the rooftops. The fire lit up the surroundings, but no one noticed him. Many of the residents living nearby were also alerted. Some of them had already put on their clothes and started helping to put out the fire. It was not because the inn owner was a popular person, but because their house would be destroyed if the fire started. Soren quickly identified his target. It was a tall man. He could not see him clearly due to the distance and the fire, but judging from the way he was yelling, he should be the inn owner during the day. Swoosh. A crossbow bolt was fired. The inn owner instantly let out a scream and hid behind a wooden plank. The man reacted quickly. It seemed like he had experienced many battles. After being attacked, he immediately shouted at his subordinates and used a wooden bucket to block in front of him. Soren did not have a crossbow specialization. It was not difficult for him to hit the target, but it was not easy to hit the vital points. However, it did not matter. The venom on the arrow would take effect in a short period of time. Even if the venom was not fatal, the paralyzing effect of the wyvern's venom would be enough to cripple the enemy. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. 3 arrows were fired consecutively from the darkness. Soren did not care about aiming. He quickly reloaded his crossbow and fired at the direction of the people. 1 arrow hit the wooden door and the other 2 hit the enemy. However, none of them hit the vital points. Clang. Soren pulled out his curved sword from his back. A cold light flashed in his eyes. He jumped down from the rooftop, rolled to reduce the force and pounced on the inn-owner who was hiding behind the wooden door. Die. The curved sword drew an elegant arc. Soren cut through the opponent's waist and instantly cut open his stomach. Large pieces of intestines were exposed. He instantly withdrew his sword and stabbed forward, piercing the opponent's heart from the chest. The wyvern's venom would take effect in 2 minutes. The strong toxicity would spread through the blood. At first it would only numb the victim, but soon the victim would lose all feeling in the wound. In the end, the victim's reaction speed would drastically decrease. This was the best venom that could be bought in the early stages of the game. It was also a must-have item for thieves to challenge boss-level enemies. A thumb-sized bottle would cost around 120 Kindler coins. It was equivalent to a rare-grade weapon. There was no time to clean up the battlefield. Soren quickly got up and rushed out, pouncing on another enemy who was hit by the arrow. The paralyzing effect would not last for long. The antibodies of the humans in this world were very good. As long as the victim did not die from the poison, they would gradually recover. The paralyzing effect of the wyvern's venom would last for 5 to 10 minutes. As long as the victim's constitution was not too high, such as 18 or even 20 points, it would be very difficult for them to be immune to the paralyzing effect. At most, it would shorten the duration of the paralyzing effect. The Whiterun city guards shouted from afar. The battle had alarmed many people, and the screams scared the nearby residents away. Soren glared at the other thugs who were hiding. He swung his curved sword and slit the throat of one of the thugs. Then he ducked down and rushed into the night. He could not let the Whiterun city guards discover him. For now he could only let the thugs escape. Fortunately, he had killed the one who seemed to be the leader of the group. The fire was getting bigger and bigger. Soon after the Whiterun city guards arrived, several wizards in gray robes appeared. They frowned as they looked at the bloodstains and corpses on the ground. Then they began to cast spells to extinguish the fire. Compared to the murder in front of them, controlling the spread of the fire was the most important thing. Chapter 49. There was a shadow cast by the corner of the city wall. Soren's body was hidden in the shadows. He calmly put away his crossbow and wiped the blood off his curved sword with an old cloth. He had killed 6 people. It seemed that these were all veterans of the gangs in the old city. Each of them gave him more than 100 slaughter EXP, especially the innkeeper who gave him more than 300 slaughter EXP. Unfortunately, due to the lack of time, he did not have the chance to loot the corpses or loot. He could only retreat after killing the enemies. It seemed that the Whiterun guards had taken advantage of all the loot, as they would have looted the corpses. Killing people was not a big deal. But arson was a big deal. The city of Whiterun did not care about the deaths of a few gray people, but they were very strict when it came to those who dared to set fire in the city. This was because once the fire spread, the consequences would be severe. The casualties and property losses would be much more serious than the deaths of a few gangsters. Soren estimated that someone would investigate this matter before tomorrow. If the city guards took this matter seriously, they would most likely hire someone special to investigate it. Then it would not be impossible for them to find out about Soren's identity. He had to leave now. Soren looked at the chaotic scene in the distance and walked along the shadow of the city wall until there was no light nearby. When he could no longer see the guards, he stopped and leaned against the wall. He took out a rope from his multidimensional bag and tied an iron hook to it. He spun the rope a few times in his hand and threw the hook into the recess of the city wall. He tightened the rope to test it, then started climbing up the wall. His 20 dexterity made him very agile. In less than a minute he had climbed up the wall more than 20 meters high. He glanced around warily. After confirming that there was no one around, he fixed the hook in place and slid down the wall using the rope. Soren grabbed the rope and swung it hard. The hook loosened and fell back into his hand. It was dark in the wild, but the unique night vision ability of the half-elves allowed Soren to still see things. He put the things back into the multidimensional bag, then bent down and went into the woods in the distance. This time it wasn't as simple as just killing those guys. Soren planned to travel along the road from Whiterun to Autumnfall. On the one hand, he wanted to accumulate slaughter EXP and level up his class when necessary. On the other hand, he wanted to find an opportunity to advance his class. On the other hand, he wanted to check out the situation along the path and figure out the distribution of monsters nearby. That way he would have more confidence when he led Vivian through this path in the future. At the very least, Soren would never get the terrain and direction wrong after walking through it once. The city was surrounded by villages. Due to their proximity to the city, none of the villages were fenced. Whiterun's guards patrolled the area regularly, and if there were any monsters or beasts nearby, they would be taken care of. Soren walked for a few kilometers in the night and entered a small village. Nowadays there were many piles of straw near the village, mainly for the convenience of making a fire and making beds. The poor people didn't have the money to buy cotton quilts, so they could only use the straw to make their beds. In the winter they would even use it as a quilt. Kong beds were relatively rare in the south and they were more common in the north. Soren lay down on a pile of straw. At first it was a little itchy, but he soon got used to it. He had been adventuring in the wilderness for many years, so he had adapted to many things. The night passed just like that. The next day, Soren was woken up by the sound of a dog barking. He didn't know who'd found him, but it was barking under the straw pile. He pulled out his curved sword and circled around, planning to kill it, but when he saw the thatched house in the distance, he put away his weapon. For these poor farmers, a dog was a very important asset. Dogs in this era were fiercer. Sometimes they would even pounce on monsters and bite them a few times. Soren had seen a dog fight a gnoll. Although it was bitten to death in order to protect its master, its courage was admirable. Perhaps it was because he remembered Heath, that brave and loyal old dog. Soren took out a piece of jerky and tossed it to the dog. The sudden food lowered the dog's guard. It looked at Soren suspiciously, but in the end, it couldn't help but bite on the jerky. Soren patted the straw off his body and jumped down from the pile of straw. He looked around, then walked toward the wilderness in the distance. The sky was just beginning to brighten. There were already farmers working in the fields. As humans, they didn't have as many talents as other races, so they had to master the skill of farming. The children in the village would start working in the fields when they were 5 or 6 years old. Gradually they would learn from their parents how to farm, when to sow, when to harvest, how to take care of the fields, and what to do in case of pests. They were the most ordinary group of people in the world. The roads in the fields were muddy. Soren quickly found the main road to Autumnfall and headed toward the Whiterun Plains. This road took a long time, taking a whole week. First he had to pass through the Black Swamp, then through the edge of the Whiterun Plains, and finally arrived at Autumnfall. The first day was relatively peaceful because it was still an area of human activity. There were militia groups stationed nearby, and a small number of regular troops. Soren didn't stop along the way. When he was tired he would rest for a while, and when he felt better he would continue on his way. It wasn't until the second day that he gradually walked out of the area of human activity that he encountered more and more things. The villages here were scattered. Only near the flat land that was convenient for irrigation, there were villages built by humans. However, they were more like villages. They were surrounded by walls on all sides, and there were watchtowers and arrow towers on top. The villages trained their own militia. When the farm was busy they worked, and when the farm was idle they would conduct simple training. There were always some young people in these villages who were unwilling to be lonely and longed for adventure. Some went out and never came back, and some returned to their hometown after giving up adventure. They were the main force in training the militia. Some of these people's profession levels were very high, but most of them were around grade 2 adventurers, and many of them were injured. If there were no accidents they would get married and have children. When they were old they would drink at dusk and boast about their adventures with their children and grandchildren. This was their life. After the excitement of the past, they would return to normal, and occasionally they would remember their comrades who had passed away. Kobold? Soren pulled out the grass and looked at the footprints on the ground. He then pressed his hand on his curved sword and continued to follow the footprints. Tracking in the wild was a skill that adventurers had to master. The best of them were undoubtedly the rangers and droll, followed by rogues like Soren. They needed to learn how to determine the target through the footprints and tracks. This ability was derived from the basic skill of survival in the wild. Soren was now relying on his past experience to determine the target. Looks like there are quite a few of them. As the ground in front of him hardened, the footprints became fainter. Soren looked around and said to himself, "I'm afraid there are 30 to 40 kobolds." Is there a relatively large group nearby? If there were no kobold settlements, these creatures would only be in small groups. They were like the hyenas of the plains of Africa. Small groups of kobolds would be stronger individually because survival in the wilderness was survival of the fittest. Large groups of kobolds would have more numbers, especially those that occupied mines. There might be more than 300 kobolds in total. On the basis of large numbers, there might be natural warlocks among the kobolds. Let's practice on them first and see if my past experience in group battles is still there. Adventurers in the wild naturally wouldn't be stupid enough to fight one-on-one with you. Group battles and chaotic battles were very common. You had to learn how to deal with multiple enemies at the same time. If you couldn't dodge or parry their attacks, you had to learn how to minimize the damage. In a chaotic battle, even with 20 points of dexterity, it was impossible to dodge all the attacks. In such a situation you had to have a piece of armor. Soren put on an ordinary leather armor and wrapped his arms with a piece of cloth. At the same time he tied up his legs. Kobolds knew how to use weapons and traps. Of course, those simple traps couldn't hurt Soren, but their self-made short bows were dangerous. Kobolds knew how to use clubs, daggers, short swords and short bows. Soren's figure gradually faded under the shadows of the trees. If one didn't look carefully, it would be hard to notice him. He pulled out his curved sword and went deeper into the forest. This battle was more dangerous than the previous ones, because he had to face a group of more than 30 kobolds. Chapter 50. The light became dimmer and dimmer. Soren gradually entered the dense forest. He could hear the cries of various animals. There was even a small elk. It looked around vigilantly, occasionally lowering its head to graze. When it noticed the shadow of Soren's position, it immediately ran outside. Because it was not destroyed by humans, there were many wild animals in the wilderness. The dense vegetation greatly increased the number of wild animals. Sometimes one could even catch wild rabbits in the fields. Soren stopped in front of a puddle. He reached out and picked up some dark red soil, put it to the tip of his nose and smelled it. It was the smell of fresh blood. This place should be very close to where the kobolds lived. Kobolds were short, reptilian humanoid creatures that were cowardly and violent. They had scales on their bodies and the color of their skin varied from dark rust to dark black. This provided them with a certain amount of protection, plus 1 innate armor. Their eyes were red and they had good night vision. They also had long tails that couldn't be curled. Most kobolds wore ragged clothes and they preferred red and orange. They would strip off the clothes of the dead and wear them. They were about 3 feet tall and weighed about 50 pounds. Kobolds could speak Draconic, but they still sounded like puppies. Like lizard men they were oviparous. They were born in a litter, so it was quite common to encounter them in the wilderness. Don't underestimate them just because of their size. Normal kobolds were more powerful than normal civilians. Although they weren't strong, they were more agile, and their dexterity could reach 13 to 15 points. They also had the talents of mining and trap making. Most kobolds could make simple traps such as tripping ropes and pit traps. Because they were naturally timid, kobolds usually didn't act alone. They usually appeared in groups of 3 to 5. They would attack when there were twice the number of enemies. If the numbers were about the same, they would call for more companions or just give up. If the situation was not good, kobolds would quickly run away. This was similar to goblins. That's right. They could eat people. Soren continued to follow the footprints and took out his crossbow. It wasn't worth it to use a poison crossbow on these small things. Otherwise, the spoils of war wouldn't be as good as the items he had used. Normal crossbow bolts would be enough to deal with these small creatures. He still had half a bottle of wyvern venom left. To be safe, Soren still carried 3 of these crossbows with him. The goal was to guard against kobold sorcerers. Kobolds were the creatures most likely to become warlocks, even though most kobold warlocks didn't have high levels. However, the frequency of its appearance was a little scary. They were staunch supporters of the theory that warlocks were inherited from the dragon race. Because kobolds had a trace of dragon blood, they communicated in the dragon language, and 1 or 2 kobold warlocks would pop out from time to time. When dealing with powerful spellcasters, it was never too much to be cautious. There were more and more bloodstains in front of him. Soren stopped in front of a patch of grass that had obviously been moved. He took out his curved sword and fiddled with it. Immediately he saw a rope. If he accidentally touched it, something might fall on him or he might be tripped and hung upside down. In the past, many people had suffered because of these small creatures. At the beginning, many people, including Soren, had rushed out to kill them, but they didn't expect to be almost killed by these small creatures. Kobolds were born with +20 trap skills, which was equivalent to the standard of a normal hunter. There was a commotion in front of him, and he could vaguely hear the barking of dogs. Soren held his weapon and slowly approached. Kobolds had a good sense of smell, better than humans but not as good as wolfhounds, so he had to be careful when he went into stealth. A group of kobolds appeared in front of Soren. There were about 30 of them. Half of them were normal kobolds, and the other half were kobold warriors with equipment. There was also a dark red kobold holding a wooden stick. He wasn't sure if it was a kobold sorcerer, but it was standing next to a large pot. If the spellcasters of this world were disguised or if they didn't have any special equipment, it would be hard to tell who they were. For example, if a priest was fighting with a stick and after a long time he cast a divine spell, only then would you realize that he knew magic. Most of the time you had to rely on your own observation skills. The pot was set up with a wooden stick, and there were kobolds throwing firewood at the side. He couldn't see clearly what was cooking inside, but Soren guessed that it could be goblins, wild beasts, mushrooms, or weeds. Kobolds were omnivores. They ate both meat and grass. When they didn't have any prey, they would cook the mushrooms and weeds in the forest to fill their stomachs. If there was a lack of food, they would fight with the nearby goblins. Usually there was no clear winner, but after the fight, both sides would cook something in the pot. If they were frugal, it could last them for 10 days to half a month. A group of kobolds surrounded the cauldron, drooling and barking from time to time. Soren saw the goblins being cut into pieces, but when he saw the remains of a female human being, his face instantly became gloomy. Kobolds didn't dare to attack the village directly. They only dared to sneak in. Sometimes they didn't even dare to attack adult males. They only dared to kill children and women. Kobolds were cowardly and cruel. They would sneak up on women and children who were alone outside the village, kill them in a short period of time, and then drag their bodies back to the village. More than 30 kobolds weren't easy to deal with. Soren hid at the side and counted carefully, judging the danger level of this group of kobolds. There were about 10 kobold warriors. They were armed with short swords, clubs, and short spears. Some of them were even wearing leather armor. Kobolds were humanoid creatures and they knew how to make equipment. Next to them were 5 kobold archers. They were armed with short bows and daggers. The bows were all made by themselves, made from wood and animal tendons. Although they weren't very powerful, it was still very painful to shoot at close range. The other normal kobolds also had weapons, but most of them were crude wooden clubs. It wasn't too much of a problem to hit them. There was only one thing that couldn't be confirmed. Was the dark red kobold beside the pot a leader or a warlock? But without a doubt it was the most dangerous one. Kobold, large group, grade 1. Challenge rating, level 3, monster level 5, leader unit and kobold warlock may appear. Highest and lowest attributes, 17 and 8, total attribute points, 60 to 75. Special abilities, natural armor, trap crafting, night vision. Difficulty, C+, loot level, +1, mining, collecting. The kobolds' loot had bonus points because they had a habit of collecting shiny objects. Of course, not all of them were kindlers. It was possible that some of them were gold, sand, and ores that they had dug out. In the information collected by Soren, many monsters would have loot bonuses based on their own habits, which meant that monsters of the same level would end up with a higher loot than monsters of the same level. Goblins also liked to collect, but unfortunately they often ended up with trash. There was a slight noise. Soren began to move towards the bonfire from the side. He had to get rid of the dark red kobold first. Only then could he ensure that this battle would be much easier. Challenge rating. Level 3 meant that he would need 5 professions that were around level 3 to deal with them easily. It wasn't easy for Soren to move alone. The most important thing was that he couldn't be surrounded. Swoosh. A crossbow bolt flew out. The dark red kobold next to the bonfire let out a scream, and the entire kennel was alarmed. Sounds similar to the barking of a puppy could be heard. After the initial panic, the kobolds began to swarm around with their weapons in hand. They quickly discovered Soren with their night vision. A group of kobold warriors growled and charged towards him. When they realized that their enemies were far fewer than them, kobolds would become more aggressive. Soren didn't rush to meet them. He almost immediately rolled to the side to dodge the arrow. The place where he was originally standing was instantly filled with arrows. The kobold's short bows were quite threatening. The curved sword in his hand glinted coldly. In just one exchange, 2 kobolds had their stomachs cut open by Soren. However, because of this momentary pause, one of the kobolds pounced towards his leg and opened its mouth to bite him. They had sharp teeth. Bang! Soren twisted his waist and kicked out, sending the kobold flying 5 meters away. He forcefully twisted his body and dodged a dagger, then swung his leg to kick another kobold that was pouncing at him. In just 30 seconds, Soren had killed 6 kobolds, but the 30 or so kobolds that had gathered together also pounced on him. His leg was slashed by a short sword, but fortunately, it was only a small cut. The arrow from the short bow hit Soren, but it didn't penetrate his leather armor. Instead, it killed a kobold beside him. The kobold warriors with the strength of a level 1 warrior surrounded Soren. These 3-foot-tall creatures were very troublesome. Every time they attacked, they would stab at the back of Soren's leg, forcing him to bend down. The kobolds had the rolling skill and they knew how to use their body size to roll and dodge. Crescent moon slash. There was no space to dodge the attacks coming from all directions. Soren gritted his teeth and used his leather armor to block 2 of the attacks. He then twisted his waist and spun around with his curved sword. 3 kobolds fell to the ground, their stomachs all cut open. But at this moment, the dark red kobold that was shot by Soren's poison crossbow shakily stood up. It uttered a strange syllable, then stretched out its hand and pushed forward. A 60-degree fan-shaped flame spewed out. Soren was the first to bear the brunt of the flame. His clothes were immediately set ablaze, followed by the kobold beside him. It was directly burned by the flame. Burning hand. Chapter 51. After the initial panic, the normal kobolds slowly regained their composure. They picked up some stones from the ground and threw them at Soren. Even though the stones didn't deal much damage, they still hurt when they hit him, especially when more than 10 stones were thrown at him from all directions. Soren's 20 points of dexterity didn't help much. No matter how hard he tried to dodge, there wasn't enough space for him to get hit. Even though the damage was only 1 point, it still hurt a lot. Burning hand. With his ability to recognize spells, Soren rolled away in an instant. He still remembered quite a lot of the drow swordsmanship, and he instantly cut off the legs of 3 kobolds nearby. This move was once nicknamed Earth Rolling Blade, because it didn't look good. Not many people learned it, but almost all melee fighters learned it because it was a life-saving skill in a chaotic battle. Rangers, warriors, and wanderers who had advanced into Earthly Hall swordsmen were top-notch experts in chaotic battles. This set of combat skills required high coordination, agility, flexibility, speed, and internal organs. The drow swordsmanship focused on attacking the lower body. Soren had seen an expert cut off the legs of more than 10 enemies in an instant. The enemies didn't even touch the corner of his clothes, and the ground was littered with severed limbs. True experts wouldn't fly around in the air because there was no place to borrow or deflect the force. They would become live targets before they even landed. The most they used was diving and jumping. Even if they could jump up to a height of 5 to 6 meters or even 10 meters, they wouldn't expose themselves in the air. The flames on Soren's body were extinguished as he rolled on the ground. However, as the kobold warlock moved, the flames from Burning Hand followed. This was one of the most troublesome level 1 spells, and it was like maggots in one's bones. Soren gritted his teeth, grabbed a kobold's corpse and threw it at the sorcerer. About 50 pounds was still within his explosive range. The kobold's corpse was thrown directly at the sorcerer, and at the same time, its spell was interrupted. Soren was caught off guard by the kobolds who were jumping and rolling around in all directions. Once again he was hit by a sword. Soren twisted his waist and got up. The moment he got up, he grabbed the ankle of a kobold with one hand. The kobold let out a terrified cry. He swung the kobold in a circle, forcing the enemies around him to back away. Then he bent his body and jumped 5 meters away, breaking out of the encirclement of the kobolds. In a chaotic battle, one must not be surrounded by enemies. Otherwise, no matter how high one's evasion and reflexes were, it would be useless. This was because there was not enough space for one to move around. In the end, one would still have to face them head-on. Swoosh. Soren took out his crossbow again and shot an arrow at the kobold warlock. Some of the kobolds took out their short bows and started shooting at Soren. However, their poor archery skills were unable to hit Soren, who was moving at high speed. Instead, they hit the other kobolds behind him. Clang. Soren pulled out his scimitar and spun it around, successfully blocking an arrow. Perhaps it was because he suddenly felt good, he actually used the blade to block 3 arrows consecutively. Die. Soren once again pounced at the kobold warlock in the distance. Spellcasters were weak in close combat, and their physique was far inferior to that of warriors. He was confident that he could cut the kobold warlock in front of him into pieces with one strike. Frost palm. The kobold warlock suddenly struck out with its palm. A faint blue light appeared in the center of its palm. Soren, who was charging at him, was instantly enveloped by a cold aura. From his scimitar to his arm, and then to his eyebrows, his entire body was covered in a thin layer of frost. The bone-chilling cold seeped into his body, and even his hands became stiff. Shadow Strike. Soren gritted his teeth and endured the first circle spell, Frost Palm. He rushed in front of the Kobold Warlock and instantly swung his scimitar down. A formless shadow energy gathered, and the Kobold Warlock's head was instantly chopped off. The thin layer of frost on its body was shattered and quickly melted away. The frost formed by magic would not last for too long. It would usually dissipate after a while. Spellcasters were always this dangerous. Fortunately, the Kobold Warlock was already dead. Soren didn't have time to look behind him. He kicked his legs and pounced at the Kobold Archer in the distance. Once the leader died, the Kobold Warlock would collapse. In other words, if they felt that they couldn't defeat the enemy, they would start to run away. Soren had spent so much effort and naturally he didn't want the enemy to run away. He had to kill as many of them as possible before the Kobold Warlock's morale collapsed. This was because once the kobolds started to flee, Soren wouldn't be able to find them in the complex environment of the forest. It would be equivalent to losing hundreds of slaughter EXP for nothing. This was also the reason why the kobolds in the wilderness were so difficult to kill. Once they couldn't defeat the enemy, they would run away faster than hyenas. You could either surround them or use ranged attacks to kill them. Otherwise you could only hunt them down one by one. Most importantly, they knew how to split up and run. The death of their leader caused the kobolds to panic. Some of the more cowardly ones tried to escape, while the braver ones wavered. After all, there was only one enemy and it seemed to be injured. Most of them were kobold warriors that surrounded them. In their eyes, they outnumbered the enemy. At the very least, they wouldn't easily run away until more than half of them were dead or injured. The battle had been going on for a few minutes. Soren's continuous attacks had consumed a lot of his stamina, and his movements were slower than before. Although he managed to dodge most of the attacks, he was still injured. It was just that the injuries weren't fatal. Injuries in the wilderness were unavoidable, especially when there were too many enemies. His leather armor blocked the arrows and most of the wounds were just scratches on his skin. There were also some bruises caused by rocks. The arrows didn't hit Soren many times, but the rocks did hit him many times. Since they didn't have to worry about killing their own kind, the kobolds threw a lot of rocks at him. When the rocks hit Soren, they also made the other kobolds cry out in pain. The real damage was from the first circle spells Burning Hand and Frost Palm. The former caused 8 points of burn damage, while the latter caused 6 points of frostbite. If it wasn't for his profession level 5, he would have been put into a heavily injured status, and his strength would have been reduced by half. However, as his injuries worsened and his stamina was depleted, Soren started to feel a little powerless. He wasn't a warrior. If it was a level 5 warrior, he would have just worn a chainmail and he would have been able to kill the kobolds. If he had a shield, the battle would have been even easier. The only thing he had to worry about was his stamina not being able to keep up. If he was too slow, he would be kited by the kobolds, and he wouldn't be able to use his explosive power to rush to the side of the kobold sorcerer. Armor greatly affected his movement speed and reaction speed. Level up the rogue class. Facing the remaining 20 kobolds, Soren decisively chose to level up. A row of data appeared in front of his eyes. The rogue class has leveled up to level 6. Received 24 DX 20 plus INT 18 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. Skill points, HP increased by 11, profession HP 6 plus, con 19 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. Received 1 free attribute point. Obtained 1 talent point, obtained 1 weapon point. Soren didn't have time to allocate other attributes, so he directly added 1 free attribute point to Vitality, and his Vitality increased from 19 points to 20 points. A surge of Vitality burst out from Soren's body. His originally tired body immediately recovered, and the 20 points of Vitality even made his wounds slightly itchy. Even the stones that the kobolds threw at him didn't hurt or itch. Extraordinary domain. The 20 points of Vitality brought about a huge difference, and at the same time, it also restored his stamina to its peak. Soren, who was originally a lot slower, suddenly burst out with power. The curved sword in his hand drew a cold light, and directly cut a kobold in half. He then took a deep breath, jumped and dived. The moment he landed, he swung his sword and killed 2 kobold archers on the spot. Even the short bows made of hardwood were cut in half when they blocked his attack. Spinning Strike. Although he didn't have any combat abilities, Soren still relied on his abundant stamina and extraordinary dexterity to perform the Rogue Blade Master's moves. His body spun 360 degrees on the spot, and the curved sword drew an arc in the trajectory of the arc, cutting 3 kobolds from their shoulders to their waists. Then, the moment he retracted his sword, he stabbed down and nailed a kobold to the ground. The morale of the kobolds finally collapsed. The ordinary kobolds began to throw away their weapons and run away. Even the kobold warriors were hesitant and fearful because the enemy in front of them seemed to have suddenly become stronger. Soren didn't stop at all. Wherever his curved sword went, limbs would be cut off. Before the kobolds went into the forest, he killed the warriors one by one, and then began to clean up the other kobolds. Unfortunately. After all, he was only one person and there were still a dozen or so kobolds that ran away. They dived into the bushes and soon disappeared without a trace. It was very troublesome to catch up with them. Clang. Soren sheathed his sword, let out a long sigh, and then began to bandage his wounds. The arrow wound was a little better because the leather armor blocked it. However, the wound on his leg that was cut by the kobold needed a simple bandage. A row of data appeared in front of him. The battle is over. After a difficult battle, your skills have improved. Dodge, move, +1, dodge, roll, +2, parry, +1, listen, location by listening to the wind, +1. Chapter 52. Cynocephaly were quite strong. Although they didn't look tall, only about 3 feet, 1 meter, tall, advanced warriors had high strength. Perhaps this was because they really did have a trace of dragon blood in them. Advanced cynocephaly warriors could reach 13 to 15 strength. If it wasn't for Soren's armor, his bones would have been injured. Soren wasn't in a hurry to collect the loot. He first bandaged his leg. He still had some healing potions, but he didn't use them. 60 silver dirhams could buy a basic healing potion which could restore 8 to 10 HP. There was no need to use them here. He had just obtained the regeneration ability from 20 vitality. After a simple bandage, he gradually recovered. He should be fine by tomorrow. After all, he didn't hurt his bones. Regeneration, elementary, gifted ability. Your strong physique has exceeded the range of mortals. What was originally a fatal injury may now only be a serious injury to you. Your strong vitality has allowed you to regenerate like a troll. You can gradually recover from any injuries below the serious injury status with time. Although you can't regrow a broken arm like a troll, as your vitality gradually increases, you will be able to do so one day. Health regeneration rate +1 per hour. This was the lowest level of regeneration. The HP recovery rate was calculated on an hourly basis. In other words, Soren could recover 1 HP per hour. He was now a level 6 rogue with 63 HP. If he didn't lose an arm or a leg, he would be able to fully recover within 3 days even if he was on his last breath. Don't underestimate this ability. Although it can't affect your recovery ability during battle, it determines that you can recover quickly after battle. Many melee professions relied on this ability to save their lives countless times until they reached the realm of legends. As for creatures like trolls, their constitution started at 25. If there was no way to suppress their regeneration ability, they could grow their heads back even if they were cut off. These creatures were at the level of biochemical beast. In this world, it was impossible to drink a potion and instantly recover to full health. Even a priest's divine spell couldn't do it. Many divine spells would overdraw energy after casting and enter a weakened state for a period of time. As for reviving? You thought too much. That was a level 9 divine spell. If you wanted to revive someone, you would have to ask the god of death of the river Styx first. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many people who died on the path to becoming legends. As long as there was a priest in the party, they could revive someone after they died. It was a simple matter. Soren had just calculated that he had obtained around 900 slaughter EXP from this battle. The normal Cynocephaly's EXP and the Cynocephaly's SEXP, the Cynocephaly's and the Cynocephaly's EXPs. SSSSSSSSSS. S's. Soren didn't have many part-time jobs. If he was a warrior, his strength was slightly lower. If he was a priest, his perception was lacking. When the time of troubles began, he would immediately become useless. He would not be able to use divine spells at all. Not to mention whether or not he had the talent to become a warlock. 16 points of charm was indeed a bit low. The only people who could take on a part-time job and display decent strength were probably the adepts. Regardless of whether it was an advancement or a part-time job, it was good. Of course, it was not as simple as just closing one's eyes. A warrior subclass required strength, a priest subclass required faith perception, and a wizard subclass required 25 points of knowledge and 15 points of intelligence. If he had the basic profession of a scholar, becoming a wizard would not be a problem. However, he was only a commoner, so he needed to improve his knowledge and skills. Becoming a part-time sorcerer was one direction. Soren was a bit hesitant as well. If he wanted to be a wizard, he would have to spend an extra 50% slaughter EXP. If he had a lot of slaughter experience, he naturally wouldn't care about these things. However, it was too difficult to gain slaughter experience. He killed so many kobolds and only got 900 points, which was not even enough to cover the cost of his soul energy. Advancing to a special profession required about 5,000 points of soul energy, slaughter experience, which was enough for him to directly level up to level 7 rogue. On the other hand, his subclass required 2,500 points of soul energy, slaughter experience, which was equivalent to the amount of slaughter experience he needed to level up by half a level. If he didn't know the power of magic very well, becoming a part-time sorcerer would quickly increase his strength. He really didn't want to do this, because if he learned all kinds of random professions, the end result would be that he would not be able to do anything. For example, Soren's previous profession level was level 10 commoner, max, level 10 rogue, level 10 lurker. Lurker was the advanced profession of a rogue and was not considered a part-time sorcerer. To reach this level of strength, he had accumulated about 2 million slaughter experience, and when he finally entered the realm of legends, he directly awakened the legendary ability Shadow Realm. However, if he were to take on other professions, the 2 million slaughter experience would only be enough for him to level up both professions to an average of level 14. A level 14 warrior wouldn't be able to withstand 10 strikes in front of him, and a level 14 wizard might not even have time to cast a spell before being killed on the spot by his shadow step. It was hard to say whether it was better to be a full-time sorcerer or a part-time sorcerer. A part-time sorcerer's ability could allow him to deal with all kinds of sudden situations and be at ease in any environment. At the same time, it could complement each other's abilities and give him 3 to 5 extra free attribute points. However, it was a pity that the speed of mastering a legendary ability was relatively slow. Although some could be obtained through the fusion of professions, it was still not as good as a full-time sorcerer. In the past, many people took on part-time sorcerers for the extra free attribute points, and they even gave up many powerful legendary abilities for it. For example, the legendary rogue's Shadow Realm was a powerful ability that allowed one to directly teleport into the Shadow Realm and so on. It required many prerequisites. If one chose to take on a part-time job, these abilities would be very difficult to obtain in a short period of time, unless one killed 1 or 2 gods and obtained a large amount of soul energy. Specialized classes had to rely on teammates because there were some battles that one could not handle alone. However, the advantage was that one could obtain the ability of the legendary realm as soon as possible. After all, one did not have to be distracted to learn the skills, specialties, of other classes. Profession level was only a part of one's strength. Many professions needed to master many special abilities. As for the final achievement, it was not easy to evaluate because there were not many people who could survive until they reached the legendary realm, let alone improve the 2 methods to the limit. Professions in the legendary realm could adapt to all kinds of complicated environments. A legendary character of a single profession would develop a certain aspect to the limit. For example, a wizard with a profession level of 40 or so could have enough spell slots to blow up a continental shelf. Therefore, most people chose to work part-time. For example, many thieves would subclass as a warrior to improve their melee combat abilities. Part-time jobs were very time-consuming. If Soren succeeded in becoming a wizard, then he would have to invest a lot of slaughter EXP into it. At the same time, he would have to train and master many wizard specialties. The energy required for this was very shocking. He would have to train at least 3 or more spellcasting specialties to reach the level of other wizards of the same level. During this time, it would be difficult for his thief strength to increase. Without the help of specialties, he would not be able to exert his full potential in battle. This was because throwing a low-level spell would not be as good as slashing with a sword. The biggest advantage of taking on a part-time job was the ability to adapt, as well as the use of various abilities. For example, greater invisibility and backstab were the reasons why it was worth taking on a part-time job. Otherwise, if the professions could not complement each other, the final result would be that the gains would not make up for the losses. It would be a waste of one's time, and at the same time, it would also limit one's achievements. After all, there were very few people who could obtain divinity. Without divinity, there was a limit to the amount of energy a soul could bear. Not to mention the difficulty of obtaining slaughter EXP. In order to obtain about 2 million slaughter EXP, Soren had to kill more than half of a hand's worth of dragons and liches. Of course, at that time the slaughter EXP was distributed by the whole team. Now he was taking all the slaughter EXP alone. In fact, if it was not so difficult to obtain slaughter EXP, there would not be so many people who fell on the road to becoming a legend. It could be said that in Soren's memory, except for a few lucky people who were lucky enough to kill the gods who fell to the mortal world, or directly obtained the shards of divinity, others walked all the way to the legendary realm, who knew how many hardships they had experienced. It was a bumpy road full of blood and tears. Perhaps it was because they had experienced too many hardships. These people who reached the legendary realm by themselves were all masters. Their challenge level was the same as the original wizards in the storyline. To kill them, the difficulty was roughly equivalent to besieging a legendary wizard's tower. P.S. These are a little introduction to the part-time jobs. It is good that everyone has an impression. The following will be easier to understand. There are some things in this book that are more obscure, so Fu Tu has tried to use simpler language to explain. Chapter 53. Soren kicked the bonfire next to him to extinguish it. Then he began to allocate his weapon points and expertise points. Warriors would have an additional weapon point before they advanced. On the other hand, thieves would have to wait until they reached profession level 6 before they could get their first weapon point. The next weapon point would be profession level 12. Weapon points were similar to specialties, but they could only be added to weapon specialties, so there was some skill involved in allocating them. Soren already knew how to increase the strength of thieves like the back of his hand. However, he had another idea because he had a legendary ability called Omnipotent Hands. Although this ability was in a sealed state, it still couldn't change the fact that it was a passive ability. Omnipotent Hands was a legendary thief's innate ability. When using any weapon in battle, the legendary thief could gain proficiency in weapons. The weapon specialties mastered by melee professions were upgraded step by step. For example, the most basic, simple weapon mastery, military weapon mastery, and exotic weapon mastery were the most basic specialties that allowed them to master various types of weapons. Then, if they wanted to improve further, they could advance to simple weapon mastery, military weapon mastery, and exotic weapon mastery. Other melee professions and mages could only master one type of weapon. For example, the priest's warhammer, spiked hammer and flail mastery, or the droll's staff, cane and scythe mastery. This was the weapon mastery. But if you wanted to improve further, you couldn't learn all kinds of weapons. Next, you had to choose a weapon that you were best at and the most comfortable to use, and then upgrade it to a higher level. Among all professions, only pure-blooded warriors could directly master the military weapon mastery specialty after advancing. Other melee professions had to choose one of the weapons to train at the weapon mastery level if they wanted to continue to improve. For example, Soren chose the curved sword mastery. Scimitar specialization. As the number of battles increases, you will become more proficient in using the scimitar. Among 100 people who use the scimitar in battle, your ability will be one of the best. You are an expert in using curved swords in battle. Even the drows in the underworld are not as good at this weapon as you. You know how to use it to cause the most damage and how to hit the enemy more easily. Accuracy +2, damage +2. If they continue to level up from the specialist level, they would reach the master level. Purebred warriors, without any subclasses, could master all the way up to military weapon master. Then they could choose to advance to sword saint, or weapon master, directly obtaining the grandmaster level of a single weapon specialty. However, other professions couldn't do the same. After all, they didn't train with different weapons all year round like warriors. They could only choose a single type of weapon to level up. For example, Soren's curved sword grandmaster. The highest level of proficiency in weapons was the master level, and only pure-blooded warriors could reach military weapon master. Other professions simply did not have the energy and time to do so. If they wanted to master it, they would have to slowly train all the military types of weapons to the master level and finally fuse them into the military weapon master specialty. Under normal circumstances, no one would be stupid enough to waste too much time on this. After all, they might as well use that time to improve their other abilities. Under normal circumstances, some pure-blooded warriors would obtain the military weapon mastery specialty at level 1, military weapon mastery at level 3, military weapon mastery at level 6 and finally military weapon master at level 9. Finally, around level 12, they would improve their other abilities and rely on advancing to Sword Saint or Weapon Master to obtain the Grandmaster level of a single weapon specialty. However, the price of this advancement meant that they would completely give up on the training of shield blocking, weapon parrying, and armor mastery. This kind of warrior's ability to move in battle would be affected even if they wore full body armor. If they didn't advance to Sword Saint, they would only be able to wear medium armor at most. Once they wore heavy armor or full body armor, their combat ability would be greatly reduced. This was the violent warrior that many people liked at that time. After the Grandmaster level was the legendary weapon specialty. If one was a Sword Saint or Weapon Master, they would generally be able to master their first legendary weapon specialty at around level 15. However, the price of this specialty was that Sword Saints would basically be unable to wear armor in battle. Weapon Masters would also not be able to train their shield blocking ability like other warriors. Soren had the Omnipotent Hands specialty. Although this specialty was in a sealed state, he still had this ability. It was just that he couldn't use it. In other words, Soren should have the effects of Simple Weapon Mastery, Military Weapon Mastery, and Exotic Weapon Mastery, but he couldn't actively use these abilities. Even if he couldn't actively use them, it didn't mean that these abilities didn't exist. It also didn't mean that these abilities couldn't be used as a prerequisite for mastering weapons. Therefore, when Soren held his breath and looked at the weapon specialization's advanced specialty, his heart couldn't help but beat faster. He saw it. He saw the weapon specialty Curved Sword Mastery in his own data. Although Omnipotent Hands was in a sealed state, it still met the prerequisite for mastering weapons. Advanced to Curved Sword Mastery. Soren excitedly chose the Curved Sword Mastery specialty. After that, the other weapon specializations began to disappear, and the Curved Sword Master specialty appeared. It wasn't as troublesome to advance a specialty from a single weapon to a master-level specialty. It didn't require any other requirements. As long as he had the prerequisite Weapon Mastery, and Weapon Mastery, he could directly obtain a master-level specialty from a single weapon type. Therefore, Soren's mastery of the Curved Sword Master specialty was even faster than the warrior's mastery of Military Weapon Mastery. Curved Sword Master. You are a master of using curved swords. It is as flexible as your arms. Among 1,000 people who use curved swords in battle, your ability is at the top. You are an expert in using curved swords in battle. If you are willing, many people will be willing to take you as their master. You can even open a dojo in the city that teaches you how to use curved swords. Accuracy +3, damage +3, attack speed +1. He really obtained a master-level curved sword specialty. Soren's face revealed a hint of excitement. He slowly grasped the curved sword in his hand. He didn't expect to obtain his first master-level specialty when he was only level 6. Clang. Soren kicked a piece of wood up and instantly swung his sword. The curved sword flashed with a cold light, and its speed was even faster than before. He could even feel the blade slicing through the air. When he chopped the wood in half, he didn't waste any of his strength. The weapon was like a part of his body. He knew how to use it to its maximum potential. Clang. The wood fell to the ground. Soren instantly swung his sword twice and chopped the wood into 4 pieces. As expected, master-level specializations are extraordinary. Soren slowly sheathed his sword. Even though he only swung his sword twice in an instant, only those who had tried to wield a weapon would know how much strength, speed, and accuracy were required. Let's use a simple example. Professional boxers usually had the ability to throw 7 to 10 punches per second. The boxing king Tyson was said to be able to throw 12 punches per second. However, if the strength of his punches was guaranteed, he would only be able to throw 3 punches per second. This was without taking into account his luck. In other words, the boxing king Tyson's strength was about the same as a level 6 monk. There wasn't much of a difference in their strength, attributes, and attack speed. The only difference was that the monk's perception was higher, while the boxing king Tyson's strength was higher. Many external martial arts experts could reach this level. Using a weapon would definitely not be as fast as punching. There was a 1-point difference in attack speed between the two. If Soren switched to master-level barehanded combat, he would be able to throw 4 punches per second if his strength was guaranteed. In other words, other than the fact that his strength wasn't up to par with the boxing king Tyson standards, he was better in all aspects. Back then, many people liked to turn historical figures into adult character cards. Of course, they would leave behind more comprehensive data about them. One of the more famous ones was Bruce Lee. In the end, his character card was equivalent to a level 7 monk, level 1 fist master. If the power of 1-inch punch was replaced by the ability 1-inch punch, and not taking into account the monk's energy, the attack speed and attributes of both sides were about the same. Their explosive power should be about the same as well. Bruce Lee Human, Grade 2. Challenge Rating, 5. Level 7 Monk, Level 1 Fist Master. Dangerous Target. Estimated Attributes: Strength 17, Dexterity 18, Constitution 16, Electric Shock, Intelligence 11, Wisdom 16, Charm 15. Special Abilities: Hand-to-Hand Combat, Grandmaster. 1-inch Punch, Grandmaster. Nunchaku, Grandmaster. Powerful Whip Kick, Powerful Side Kick, Spinning Kick, Intuitive Evasion, Nimble Movement. Difficulty, B-. Difficulty, A+ when using Nunchaku. According to the statistics, this was one of the few people who were close to Grade 3. Because of the innate potential of the people on Earth, their attributes were greatly reduced. At the same time, their HP was only around 20 points. They didn't have the vitality and recovery ability of many creatures in this world. Basically, a level 5 warrior would be unparalleled among ordinary people. After all, there was only one Bruce Lee in the billions of people on Earth. The ratio of world-class boxing champions was also 1 in a billion. As for professions above Grade 3, they were beyond the scope of human beings. There was no comparison between the two. When a Grade 3 barbarian went berserk, his strength was simply terrifying. P.S. This chapter took almost 6 hours to edit and rewrite. I'm speechless. You guys have to make do. You should be able to understand. Chapter 54. After distributing all the points, Soren began to clean up the battlefield. There wasn't anything good on the kobolds, so Soren began to look for boxes. These creatures liked to hide the good things they collected, and most of them were hidden near their gathering place. Since they were only about 1 meter tall, kobolds usually didn't carry any loot with them. First, he rummaged through the kobold sorcerer's corpse and found some random items. Unfortunately, they were all trash. Soren then began to observe the surroundings, and soon found a stone that was a little different. The ground nearby had been dug up. He pulled out his curved sword and began to dig. He directly lifted the stone and found a wooden box buried below. It looked very simple, but when he took it out, it was heavy. He opened it with the hilt of his sword and looked inside. It was full of gold sand. He didn't expect these kobolds to be so rich. Gold sand was an unrefined gold ore. It was actually gold with very low purity. It could be exchanged for kindler in the temple of the goddess of wealth. Most of the priests of the goddess of wealth took this job, and it was generally fair. Soren reached his hand into the gold sand and felt around. He found a piece of agate, a small piece of obsidian, 3 pieces of opaline, and 1 or 2 stones that he couldn't identify. Kobolds had a talent for mining, and they also liked to live in caves. Even in the wilderness, they could occasionally find some good things in the caves. If they defeated a creature, the nature of the low-level dragon bloodline made the kobolds automatically collect the shiny objects. Not bad. Soren carefully poured the gold sand into the multidimensional bag, and then put the stones inside. He muttered to himself, "Looks like it's worth about 100 kindler. 20 kindler weighed 1 pound, and the gold sand just now should be worth about 60 or 70 pieces. There were more ores in this world, and these stones were worth about 30 kindler. However, if he wanted to sell them, he would have to find a jewelry merchant, and the price might be lowered. Normal kobold tribes wouldn't have accumulated so much loot, but it was probably because of the kobold wizard. Wherever there was a wizard, the loot would always be higher. If they killed the spellcasters, stripping them naked was a very normal thing. The kobold sorcerer was only around level 2. It didn't have anything good on it except for the ebony staff +1. This was the least valuable rare grade equipment. It was made of a special kind of wood that was relatively sturdy. It was like ironwood and didn't have any additional effects. However, it was very hard and could be used to block weapons. It was about 10 kindlers worth. It was about the same price as Soren's scimitar, but not many people were willing to buy it. The low-grade droll would like to carry it with them because it would not affect their spell casting. It could also be used as a spell casting material at critical moments because it was made of wood. Soren took the valuable items and quickly left. The smell of blood was very likely to attract nearby beasts, including wolves, ogres, gnolls, and other creatures. If he stayed here, he might run into them. He had suffered a lot in the past. He was almost turned into dumplings by the gnolls who were attracted by the smell of blood. It was very difficult to keep these corpses for more than 2 days. Other creatures would probably be attracted by night. If he was strong enough, he could wait for them to come. Unfortunately, Soren was still injured. It would be fine if the wolves were attracted, but if the gnolls were attracted he would be screwed. Gnolls had a monster level of 3. If they had an advanced profession, their monster level and their profession level would be equivalent to a level 5 warrior. 1 or 2 gnolls would be fine, but the problem was that gnolls usually moved in groups of 3 to 5. If I want to become a wizard, I'll just need a spellbook. Soren returned along the way he came. There was a human village nearby. He wanted to see if he could spend the night there. It was too dangerous to sleep alone in the wilderness. If he was ambushed in the middle of the night, he would be done for. Moreover, it was difficult for him to sleep well. He basically couldn't fall asleep in the wilderness. At most, he could only take a nap. Spellbooks were not cheap. If he was a wizard, he would naturally bring one with him. However, if he wanted to advance, he would have to spend money to buy one. It was worth about 150 Kindler coins. This was the most common spellbook. A special spellbook could be worth thousands of Kindler coins. Bang! The dull sound of a gunshot suddenly spread far and wide in the wilderness. Soren was a little dazed when he heard the gunshot. He quickly hid in the shadows and rushed in the direction of the gunshot. Was it a gnome or a dwarf? Primitive firearms rarely appeared among humans. Alchemy products were strictly controlled, and it was very difficult to buy them in the black market. The power of firearms was not as great as people thought. They were good against ordinary people but not so good against professionals. Even sniper rifles made by alchemy were not as useful against high-grade professionals as people thought. It was even more difficult to deal with spellcasters. Some people once joked that if they did not make nuclear warheads, they would not be able to threaten legendary spellcasters. Of course, this was just an exaggeration. The churches of the gods had very strict restrictions on alchemy products, second only to the taboo research on life creation. It was said that this was to avoid the catastrophe of the Arcane Empire. There were records that the floating fortress of the Arcane Empire broke the continental shelf into 8 pieces. Even the largest nuclear weapon was not that powerful. Even if nuclear weapons were to be used to destroy the Earth, it would at most destroy humans and creatures. It would not be a big problem for the Earth itself. However, there were spells and alchemy weapons in this world that could directly destroy a plane. They could even sink a piece of the continental shelf to the bottom of the sea. Of course, that was during the Arcane Empire. It was several eras before. The arcanists of that time were very powerful, even more so than the wizards of today. The golems, robots, that the wizards made now. They were the descendants of the Arcane Empire's magic-powered constructs. Soren had seen them when he was exploring the ruins at the bottom of the sea. If someone told him that they were super-powered armors made by humans in the interstellar era, they would have believed it. They had almost been wiped out. At first, it was strange to see them, but they gradually got used to it. If Soren remembered correctly, the dwarven alchemists of Toldra had already started to research rocket technology. In the end, they accidentally injured a black dragon and brought about a devastating disaster. Alchemy products were still very strictly controlled at this time. Since the gods had yet to descend and the churches were unprecedentedly powerful, there were not many people who dared to use alchemy weapons. Grey dwarves? Soren's pupils shrank as he hid in the shadows. About a few hundred meters away, a group of grey dwarves was attacking a wizard. Some of them were holding primitive guns as thick as bowls. This was what attracted Soren's attention. The wizard was surrounded in the middle. There were more than 10 grey dwarven warriors around him. Asterisk bang bang bang. Asterisk 3 consecutive gunshots rang out. The bullets were fired at the wizard, but when they were about a meter away from him, the stone pellets were deflected and flew in another direction. Otherwise, they would have exhausted all their kinetic energy and landed directly at the wizard's feet. High-grade mage armor? Soren stealthily snuck in. His expression was serious. This was the first time he had seen high-grade wizards fight. A grade 3 wizard. His profession should be at least level 10. He didn't seem to be a human wizard. A group of grey dwarven warriors attacked him, but no matter if it was swords, axes, or bullets, they were all blocked at least a meter away from him. This was a wizard's defensive force field. Defensive force fields were divided into 2 types, armor and deflection. Armor was used to block the attack from the front, while deflection was used to deflect the attack. The level 1 mage armor had a defensive strength of 20, which wasn't enough to withstand 1 strike from Soren. However, the defensive strength would increase according to the wizard's level and strength. If a high-grade wizard cast mage armor, it could at least block 3 strikes from Soren. Since he didn't have any rare-grade weapons, his strike could at most deal 20 damage. At that time, many melee professions called it the at-type force field, and complained that the wizards were indeed cheating. Chapter 55. A group of Durgar warriors surrounded him. The wizard's barrier was finally broken. After all, there was a limit to how much damage it could take. However, when a Durgar warrior's axe landed on the wizard's body, it bounced back as if it had hit a marble wall. Stone Skin. Soren already knew the outcome of the battle. Stone Skin could take up to 150 points of damage. They had to surround the wizard and attack him in order to break through his stone skin. There didn't seem to be any high-grade warriors among the Grey Dwarves. Just a bunch of Grade 2 warriors wouldn't be able to kill a high-grade wizard. As expected, one of the Durgar warriors was stunned for a moment, then suddenly turned around and chopped off his companion's head with his axe. Enraged Charm. The Durgar warrior suddenly went on a killing spree. He killed 3 of his companions in one go before being killed by the others. Not a single spellcaster? Soren looked around and pursed his lips. They didn't even bring a priest. Are they trying to get themselves killed? It's about time for a large-scale attack, right? As soon as he finished speaking, a gust of wind suddenly blew across the battlefield. The wizard's speed suddenly became extraordinary. In an instant he had opened up a distance of nearly 50 meters. He then quickly cast a spell, and a spider web spread out, trapping many Grey Dwarves in it. Spider web was based on strength and dexterity. Could be used to dodge or break free. However, it was difficult for low-grade warriors to dodge a high-grade wizard's web. The wizard quickly cast a spell, and a basketball-sized fireball appeared in front of him. He pointed his finger forward, and the fireball immediately flew out and exploded in the middle of the Durgar warriors. Fireball. Perhaps it was because of the game of pickle in the 21st century, but many people thought that fireball was a spell that could be casually thrown out. However, fireball's level was not low. It was a level 3 evocation spell, and could only be cast by a level 6 wizard. The power of the spell was similar to what was happening right in front of their eyes. With a loud bang, it was as if a grenade had exploded in the middle of the Durgar warriors, and a Durgar warrior was instantly blasted into pieces. The scorching flames wreaked havoc, and the impact of the explosion sent the Grey Dwarves nearby flying. The Durgar warriors who were lucky enough to survive also spat out mouthfuls of blood. Many of their fur and clothes were on fire. Around professional level 12. Soren could roughly estimate the level of the enemy based on the fireball's power. If a wizard of a higher level cast a fireball, at least half of the dwarves would have died from the fireball's attack. The fireball spell was one of the spells he was most familiar with. There was a time when the 5 fireball holy sect was popular. 5 rank 2 magi would cast a fireball spell at the same time. The concentrated area of effect explosion and high-temperature flames would directly wipe out the enemies within a 60-feet radius, leaving behind a crater with a diameter of 3 meters. He shouldn't have many spell slots left, right? Soren furrowed his brows as he glanced at them. His expression showed a hint of eagerness. Even though the spellcasters seemed to have cheats, they were still at the mercy of others after casting their spells. It seemed that the wizard had been fighting for a long time. There were at least 20 or 30 Durgars who had died nearby, and he must have used up a lot of spell slots. Spider spawn. The wizard threw something and it landed on the corpse of a Durgar. Immediately, 2 spider eggs appeared and quickly expanded. Finally, 2 venomous spiders the size of millstones emerged from the dark green liquid. After the venomous spiders appeared, they hissed and then quickly rushed to the other Durgars under the wizard's command. Soon 2 or 3 warriors were bitten to death. Soren's hair stood on end. He looked at them in shock and murmured, "Dark elves?" Spider spawn was a very obscure level 4 spell. Depending on the wizard's level, it could spawn 1 to 3 spiders in a short time. It mainly depended on the spellcasting materials and the wizard's level. Venomous spiders could be level 6 to 8, and special species of spiders could even be cultivated. Not only were they dangerous, but they also had spell-like abilities. This was a very rare spell that could only be learned by the wizards of the underground world. The ones who were best at it were the dark elf wizards and priests. This was because they believed in the Spider Queen Lolth, an evil and powerful deity. The wizard's protective force field was still intact, and he was not hurt at all. The Durgars finally began to despair. Some of them turned and ran, but they were bitten to death by the swift venomous spiders. Some wanted to fight with their lives, but their heads were blown off by the flying arcane missiles. A high-grade wizard's arcane missile could penetrate a 0.3 centimeter thick steel plate. It was equivalent to the power of a pistol shot from 100 meters away. Even if it did not hit the vital parts, it could still open a hole in the body. Sometimes it could even penetrate armor. Soren gave up the idea of taking the risk in his heart because the Dark Elves were very cunning. He definitely had some fatal spells that he had not used yet. From beginning to end, this was a massacre. A high-grade wizard had killed 30 low-grade Duergar warriors in a variety of ways. Apart from the initial danger of almost breaking the protective force field, there was basically nothing they could do to the wizard. Among all the professions, only a sword saint could break the protective force field of a wizard of the same rank in one hit. The other professions would need at least 2 to 3 hits, and it would be even more difficult if there was a gap between their professions. If Soren had a real rare-grade weapon, he would be able to break the protective force field in 1 second. Unfortunately, he could not kill the wizard in one hit. The wizard's robe seemed to be a piece of rare-grade equipment, and there must be a protective spell on it that had not been activated yet. Buttons, brooches, rings, gems, headwear, necklaces, amulets. Many of the things that looked like decorations could be the rare-grade equipment that the wizard carried with him. These wizards were so rich that it made one's hair stand on end. A second-grade wizard was worth 5,000 to 6,000 Kindler coins, and a third-grade wizard was worth at least 10,000 Kindler coins. Otherwise, Soren would not have called them wizards. Do I have the confidence to win against him? Soren stared at the wizard who was leaving in the distance. 2 poisonous spiders the size of millstones followed behind him. They could still survive for a while, but they would quickly age and die. The wizard was still very vigilant. The 2 spiders protected him on both sides as he walked towards the plains in the distance. No one knew what his final destination was. After all, the Dark Elves were not used to the sunlight on the ground. If I can break the protective force field, the wyvern's venom should be able to paralyze him. After all, most wizards don't have high vitality. Unless he has a spell on him beforehand, his fortitude won't be able to pass the test of poison. If the poison takes effect, the failure rate of his spell casting will be at least 50%, and he might not even be able to cast a spell. But the problem is, how many layers of protective force fields does he have? Do I have the confidence to hit him before he can cast a spell? Soren slowly withdrew his curved sword. He had less than 10% confidence in defeating this high-grade wizard, even if he had used a lot of spells. Against wizards, he needed to explode. If he couldn't break through their protective force field in one go, he would be killed by their spells sooner or later. When Soren became a legendary rogue, he had killed hundreds of wizards along the way. He knew the terrible consequences of letting them have time to cast spells. Too bad I didn't learn Shadow Jump. Otherwise, I would have killed him in one hit. A rogue with a profession level of 12 and above could learn Shadow Jump if they specialized in shadow magic. They could temporarily enter the shadow plane and return to the material plane through the shadow plane. Although it was only for a second, it was enough for Soren to pass through the protective force field and directly attack the wizard. This was the key to mastering the legendary skill Shadow Realm. Top-tier rogue assassins love to assassinate across planes. Shadow Step also allowed them to pass through the shadow passage and appear behind the enemy. The wizard's figure was getting farther and farther away. Dark Elves wouldn't appear on the surface world for no reason. Soren was sure that something was going to happen, but he didn't know what it was. A wizard with a profession level of 12 had a high status. There weren't many reasons for him to appear in the wilderness alone. Chapter 56. Soren waited for a long time. When he was sure that the wizard had left, he walked towards the corpses of the Grey Dwarves. There should be something valuable on them. Although the high-ranked wizard didn't think much of it, he was still a thief with a little sister to feed. The more money he had, the better. The little girl would need to spend a lot of money in the future, so he had to prepare some savings. Besides, if he really wanted to spend money, a set of rare-grade equipment would cost him more than 3,000 Kindler coins. There were bloodstains everywhere on the ground, and it seemed like a sudden battle had taken place. Internal conflict? Soren looked at the footprints nearby and frowned. It seems like they were on the same side at first. I don't know why they suddenly started fighting. The footprints were very neat, as if a group of people were protecting something as they moved forward. The footprints behind him started to get messy. When a person was running at full speed, the footprints would naturally be different from when they were walking. Soren tried to reconstruct the scene in his mind, but he could only vaguely tell that the Grey Dwarves had suddenly attacked. Because there were traces of second-grade warriors charging on the ground, they were able to stimulate their potential in a short period of time and burst forward with astonishing speed. Even an ordinary warrior could reach the speed of an Olympic champion. What's this? Soren reached out and picked up a shard. He then turned over the 3 corpses and found a gray dwarf with a hole in his chest. There were traces of corrosion around the wound. Acid arrow? Soren carefully took off the ring on the corpse's finger, and a look of surprise appeared on his face. So they brought a wizard with them, but he was killed in an instant. There was a wizard in the gray dwarf's team. However, he was only a second-grade wizard around level 5. Perhaps because the battle had happened so suddenly, he didn't have time to react before the high-ranked wizard killed him with an acid arrow. Soren touched the ring, and a faint glow of magic appeared on it. The smile on his face became more and more obvious. This was a low-ranked wizard's ring, and it could store an additional level 1 or 2 spells. It's worth at least 1,200 Kindler coins. Soren put the ring away and continued to rummage through the dead dwarf's body. He thought to himself, he didn't even touch the dead bodies of his peers. Either he's too rich to care, or there's something very important that he can't afford to delay. What else happened during this period of time? Damn it. Why didn't you pay more attention to the changes in the situation? Soren quickly took out a multidimensional bag. It was also a low-level multidimensional bag. Even though a rank 2 Magus wealth wasn't low, it still wasn't considered a tycoon. There were a lot of things inside and not many of them were valuable. However, there was one thing that Soren really wanted. That was a spellbook. The Grey Dwarf Wizard's spellbook was a thick black book with mysterious runes engraved on the outside. It wouldn't be damaged by natural causes and could be maintained for a long time. Soren flipped to a page. It was filled with densely packed runes, many of which he couldn't recognize. Since he didn't have the arcane text recognition ability, he could only use his experience to determine the spells that were copied from the book. The first spell was the Giant Transformation spell. It could double the size of a creature and increase the user's strength by 2, but it would also decrease the user's agility by 2. If one had a metamagic ability, this spell could also be used on certain areas to double the size of certain things. Of course, this effect wasn't created by the natives of the storyline. It was created by someone who had spent a lot of time combining metamagic abilities. It could also be used together with the shrinking spell. The second spell was the Arcane Missile spell. It was one of the most common spells used by wizards because it only took 1 second to cast. Soren didn't recognize 1 or 2 of the spells that were recorded, but he could still remember most of them. They were Charm Person, Burning Hand, Rainbow Spray, Mage Armor, Shield, Web, Brute Force and Flame Arrow. Each spell was recorded on more than 10 pages. Of course, the spells didn't have to be that long. There were also many diagrams, some of which were even 3-dimensional. These were the legendary spell models. After a wizard copied a spell onto a spellbook, they would spend a period of time to analyze and construct it. It wasn't as simple as copying a spell onto a spellbook. According to their talent and intelligence, a wizard would need a long period of time to understand the spell and construct a spell model in their brain. Finally, they would connect their perception to the magic net and form a spell slot to record it. The spell model would be stored in their brain. After casting the spell, they would need to use up the energy gathered through the magic net and memorize the spell model again. It was a simple analogy. A spell model created by a wizard was like a bullet. It needed to be loaded into a spell slot created by the magic net. The bullet would be shot out and the spell would disappear. The spell model would disappear and the wizard would need to memorize it again through a spellbook. Unless the wizard's talent was so good that they could recall a complicated circuit board without the help of notes. There couldn't be a single mistake in the process of memorizing the spell model. If there was a mistake, the spell would backfire. The higher the level of the spell, the more severe the backfire. It could even explode the wizard's brain. In Soren's memory, apart from advanced arcanists, there weren't many people who could memorize spells without the help of a spellbook. Most arcanists had around 25 points of intelligence, which was equivalent to a biological computer. The memory of a normal person, even an excellent wizard, couldn't reach that level. This was why they had to carry a spellbook with them at all times. Mastering spells took a long time. A wizard with 18 points of intelligence would need at least half a month to learn a level 1 spell. However, it was much easier to memorize the spell after learning it. All they needed to do was spend some time meditating after casting the spell, and they could recreate the spell model. Therefore, the number of spells a wizard could learn was limited. Normally, a high-grade wizard would know many spells while a low-grade wizard would know very few. Only a legendary wizard would have enough time and energy to learn more spells. What's this? Sauron took out a special roll of paper. After opening it, he took a look and quickly put it away. There was a symbol of 3 tentacles on it. If he remembered correctly, it was called Shadow Tentacles. It was a level 4 spell that could summon 3 tentacles of energy to bind the enemy. The dwarf wizard didn't record it in his spellbook, which meant he was probably a wizard below level 7. A wizard's value was really high. Soren calculated the value of the loot. It was worth more than 2,000 Kindler coins. Oh whoa! While Soren was happily rummaging through the other corpses, a wolf's howl came from afar. He sped up and put everything into the multi-dimensional bag he just found. He then came to the corpses of the dwarves with primitive firearms. So it's a stone pellet gun. He picked up an alchemy weapon, weighed it in his hand, and then stuffed it into his multi-dimensional bag. This gun was as thick as an adult's arm, and it was made of polished stone bullets. It was a relatively low-level alchemy gun, and some dwarves would be equipped with it. Because of its primitive craftsmanship, its shooting range and accuracy were average, and its firing speed was not fast. Sometimes, its power was not as good as a crossbow or a longbow, especially the longbows of some human-like races. Its effective shooting range was more than 300 meters, and it could penetrate half a centimeter thick steel plate. It was like a sniper rifle. The craftsmanship of this primitive gun was similar to that of the 18th century. There were even better guns in the hands of the dwarves of Toteldry. Due to their inferior physique, these dwarves were very dedicated to alchemy research. Unfortunately, these weapons couldn't defeat a black dragon with a monster level of 24. In the end, the whole city was destroyed by the dragon's breath. It was estimated that this would happen in about a year. The howls of the wolves were getting closer and closer. Soren hurriedly cleaned up the corpses and headed toward the road. He didn't want to fight a pack of wolves right now. The sky was getting darker and darker, and many wild creatures were starting to move. The smell of blood here would attract many carnivores. As Soren was leaving, he saw a pair of ghostly green eyes in the forest. It was a Knoll scout. They could smell blood within a 1-kilometer radius, and they would spread out when hunting. When they found their prey, they would summon their companions through a special sound. It was likely that these wolves would have to fight the Knolls. There would be a carnival tonight, so it was better to stay away from them. Chapter 57. Any high-grade profession could be understood as a superhuman. Profession level 10 and above basically had 1 or 2 supernatural abilities. For example, the droll just now had some kind of spell on her body, which was why she could jump between trees. Soren was not curious enough to chase after her. It was normal to meet strangers in the wilderness. Some would talk for a short while, but most would just pass by. As long as the other party did not have any bad intentions, both parties would just nod at each other. Droll did not like to communicate with ordinary people, not even professionals. They were solitary and had their own goals. Most of them had strong beliefs and were neutral in their behavior. Sometimes they would attack anyone. In their eyes, balance was higher than good and evil, because they believed that good and evil in the world were relative. They were like a group of people who advocated inaction, but their aggressiveness was not weak at all. Many people who destroyed the nature of the forest would be mercilessly executed by them. There was a period of time when human alchemy research was popular, mainly because of the discovery of the ruins of the Arcane Empire. Many wizards found high-end alchemy knowledge from it, and they even developed a construction factory. However, the pollution caused by magic energy alchemy destroyed the water source, polluted the earth, killed animals, and destroyed the forest. This eventually led to the anger of the droll group in the world. Terrible storms and lightning shrouded the whole new alchemy city, and in the end, everything was turned into ashes. There were not many records left of that battle. It was only known that the droll defeated the army of steel golems. More than 10 legendary droll fought at the same time, including the powerful Storm Lord. The wizards were badly hurt in this battle. 1 legendary wizard died, and 2 legendary wizards were forced to turn into liches. Research on magic energy alchemy became a taboo. In order to appease the angry droll, the human world's church began to increase the restrictions on magic energy alchemy. This was because the place where the alchemy city was built, the river was still full of black pollution. The nearby land was not suitable for human survival, and drinking the water would cause metal poisoning. The droll stubbornly believed that this evil alchemy research would eventually destroy nature, causing irreparable damage to the environment, and eventually bring disaster to the whole world. So, even for the dwarves and gnomes, some alchemy research was still carried out in secret. Most of the wizards were not on good terms with the droll, because many of their academic studies were rejected by the droll. Even now, there were still droll hiding in the dark to monitor the wizards' actions, preventing them from carrying out some terrible experiments that could cause large-scale natural disasters. Sometimes they would also take care of the plagues and diseases spread by the fallen. Soren walked back along the road. Soon he saw the village that he had seen at the beginning. Torches were lit on all sides of the village, and he could vaguely see the defense of the arrow towers. "Who is it?" a sturdy man shouted. Soren's figure emerged from the night. He raised his hands to show that he wasn't holding any weapons and said, "Human, a traveling adventurer. I just encountered a group of kobolds and am a little injured. I hope I can rest here for the night." After seeing Soren's appearance, the man on the watchtower relaxed a little. He shouted down, and soon a man wearing leather armor appeared. He seemed to be the captain of the militia here. It was a man with a full beard, estimated to be in his 30s or 40s. He frowned and looked at Soren, then asked, "Are you alone? It's not suitable for a person to move around in the wilderness." This was a former adventurer, and he obviously had a lot of experience. Although he knew Soren's profession, he was still very vigilant. "Yes, I'm alone." Soren put down his hands and replied, "I want to train my abilities and find the possibility of further improvement. So I'm alone in the wilderness." The captain hesitated for a moment, then waved his hand to signal the others to open the gate. He then said, "You can rest here for the night, but I hope you won't cause us any trouble." "There won't be any trouble," Soren smiled and said in a deep voice, "I'll leave tomorrow to hunt the nearby monsters. If it's possible, I hope you can tell me the distribution of the nearby monsters." The creatures in the wilderness naturally wouldn't just stay in one place. Only the natives in the area knew where they lived, so it was important to explore the wilderness and gather information. Sometimes it could save a lot of trouble. The heavy gate of the stronghold slowly opened. 5 or 6 adult men stood nearby with weapons in their hands. Their eyes were still very vigilant as they looked at Soren. They were slightly relieved when they saw that Soren did not make any movements after coming in. The captain climbed down from the watchtower and looked at Soren from head to toe. His eyes fell on his bandaged wounds, then he said, "It's rare to see a lone adventurer like you. I didn't expect a rogue to be like a monk." Soren smiled and didn't answer the question. The captain waved his hand to his companions, then pointed to the side and said, "Stranger, we can't trust you completely. So no one will take you in for the night. There's a firewood shed over there. If you don't mind, you can stay there for the night. I'll have someone send you some hot soup and food." Soren nodded and bowed slightly. "Thank you very much. I just need a place where I can sleep without worry. After all, it's easy to be ambushed in the wilderness." The captain nodded and asked a young man to lead him there. After Soren left, an adult man next to him said, "Captain? Is he okay? He's a stranger after all. You should be fine." The captain looked behind him and said in a low voice, "I'll go and test him later to see if he really killed a group of kobolds. It's getting more and more dangerous here. If someone can kill some of the monsters, we'll be under less pressure." The wilderness was dangerous. They built a village here to avoid a lot of taxes, but they also had to face a lot of trouble. The captain of the militia came over with 2 men. Soren rested on the soft grass and bandaged the wound on his leg. It was almost healed. There shouldn't be any problems tomorrow, and it wouldn't affect his upcoming battle. The armed forces of this village weren't weak. Soren saw a few second-grade warriors, and there should be experienced adventurers among them. They brought him some hot soup, some dry bread and some pickled vegetables. The one who brought them over was a chubby girl with freckles on her face. She looked at Soren curiously and blushed slightly when she saw his handsome face. She seemed like a simple village girl. She seemed to want to stay and listen to what they had to say, but the captain glared at her and she obediently went back to sleep. Before she left, she looked back at Soren. Young people like her were always curious about adventurers. Soren thanked her softly and took a sip of the soup. There were mushrooms and vegetables in it, and the bread needed to be soaked in it. It was natural to feel uncomfortable eating too much dry food. As he ate, he answered the other party's questions and probing questions. This wasn't surprising. After all, he was a stranger. "You said you killed a large group of kobolds?" The young man next to him looked doubtful, as if he didn't believe Soren had such strength. He wasn't interested in explaining, so he pulled out his curved sword and cut a piece of wood into 4 pieces. This time, the young man finally shut his mouth and looked at him with a trace of respect. Soren had used up a lot of energy. He finished the soup and bread and chewed some jerky before he stood up and said, "I want to know about the distribution of monsters nearby. Can you provide me with some information?" The captain had already put down his doubts and nodded. "No problem. There are many monsters around here, and we've been hoping that someone can deal with them. You can come here to rest at any time. I'll have someone prepare food and a place for you to sleep. It's late now. If you don't mind, you can sleep in my house for the night. I'll get someone to prepare a room for you in 2 days. Soren smiled and shook his head. He patted the pile of grass and said, No need. This place is good. I'm used to it. Now tell me where the monsters are. Chapter 58. The sky was just beginning to brighten. A silhouette shuttled through the dense forest. The forest was truly a primeval forest, and there were no signs of roads at all. If it weren't for Soren's sturdy clothes, his clothes would have been torn a few times already. There were all kinds of small animals in the forest. Squirrels and rabbits were the most common, followed by all kinds of birds. It had to be said that a place without human activity was full of vitality. No wonder the druids were so against others destroying the forest. They had even fought several times because of this and killed many people. Soren quickly arrived at the edge of the forest, following the directions given by the militia captain. It was around noon. There were obvious signs of logging nearby. Intelligent creatures in the wilderness would build their own settlements, and some large groups of gnolls would even build their own camps. Soren didn't dare to get too close because his current stealth couldn't achieve the same effect as invisibility. It was just that he would become hazy in the shadows, and no one would be able to see him unless they looked carefully. As for sneaking up behind an enemy, that required skill and the environment, especially when dealing with hostile creatures. Invisibility didn't really mean that one would disappear. Enemies with sharp senses could still sense that someone was approaching. The biggest advantage of stealth was that one could hide in the shadows at any time. Most of the time, once one left the enemy's line of sight, it wouldn't be easy for them to find you again. Although backstab was a powerful ability, it required a lot of conditions to activate it. Soren followed the shadows and circled around the area. He found 3 gnoll guards. Large groups of gnolls included the old, the weak, women, and children. When the adults went out to hunt, some would stay behind to guard them. The gnolls didn't have houses in their settlements. They were just surrounded by a circle of wood. They knew how to make fires and equipment, but they were limited to making leather armor. Female jackalens would peel off the skin of their prey and sew it into leather armor using crude methods. Some gnolls would use weapons in battle, and those who hadn't advanced would use claws and teeth. There are 3 guards. There should be quite a few of them. Soren took out his crossbow and loaded it with a poisoned bolt. It was impossible to sneak in during the day because the vision was too good. The gnolls would be able to spot him as soon as they saw him. He needed 150 points in stealth to achieve the same effect as invisibility, and he had to be in the shadows. He was still a few dozen points away from that. Although the invisibility effect was invisible to the eyes, the slight sound of movement and the flow of air were still there. Therefore, to deal with enemies who had the blind warfare specialty and high perceptive sense, the skill points needed to be very high. Soren's goal was to earn slaughter EXP, not to clear out this group of gnolls. Naturally, there was no need for him to attack the camp. He circled around and hid in the nearby bushes, then crawled on the ground and slowly crept towards the camp. Even with invisibility, it would be useless to walk over directly. The footprints and the things you stepped on would expose your position. It would be even more obvious if there was water on the ground. When wizards cast invisibility, they would combine it with lighten and instant slither. There were some creatures in the shadow plane that were permanently invisible. Soren had fought against them before and they were very difficult to deal with. The gnolls were wearing leather armor. Soren frowned and moved closer. If he didn't hit any vital points, the damage of the crossbow would be reduced. Even if he didn't want to kill the enemy with the crossbow, he still needed to ensure that the poison could seep into the enemy's blood. Swoosh! A gnoll suddenly screamed. The nearby guards were alarmed, and there was even a commotion from within the camp. Soren quickly reloaded his crossbow and shot at another gnoll. The wyvern's poison would take effect quickly. He pulled out his curved sword and rushed over. These gnolls were level 3 creatures, and often had the strength of a level 1 to level 3 warrior. It wouldn't be easy to deal with them. Oh whoa! Faced with Soren's surprise attack, the gnolls' first reaction wasn't to surround him, but to howl and call for their companions. The gnolls wouldn't stay in the camp all the time. They would search for prey during the day. If it was a wild beast, they would try to kill it. If it was a humanoid creature, they would secretly follow it and then ambush it in the evening or night. As carnivores, they had huge appetites. No matter how much prey there was, they could finish it all. When they were very hungry, they would also eat grass and mushrooms. Gnolls spent most of their time hunting and preparing to hunt. A gnoll's appetite was equivalent to that of an adult tiger. They were the most greedy and hungry wild creatures. There were 3 adult gnolls. One used claws and fangs, one was equipped with a bone crusher hammer, and one used a simple mace. Soren's advantage wasn't that obvious. These creatures were around 2 meters tall and weighed around 300 pounds. Their heads were similar to a coyote's and their skin was mostly gray. The color of their mane was messy, but their overall color was darker. Their strength and agility were higher than humans and could reach 15 points or more. However, their intelligence was lower. There were also priests who worshipped the gnoll god, but wizards and sorcerers were rare. A wolf howl came from afar. Soren raised his curved sword and slashed down. The sword slashed at the gnoll's arm, cutting off half of its claw. There was a muffled sound of wind breaking behind him. He had no time to dodge, so he could only roll forward. At the same time, he slashed at the gnoll's ankle. There was only 1/3 of the wyvern's venom left, and he had already smeared it on his scimitar. Bam! The mace hit the ground, creating a crater. If it had hit the head, it would have splashed brain matter. Many gnolls liked to use heavy weapons because it was convenient to crush bones. Bone marrow was the most delicious food for gnolls. A jackalen that was obviously smaller in size rushed out, along with 2 small aardwolves. Shadow strike. Soren had already predicted the number of enemies. He turned around and killed the first gnoll that was poisoned. A row of data appeared. Gnoll warrior killed. Target killed. Obtained 270 slaughter EXP. Whoosh! The sound of a weapon piercing through the air was heard. Soren waved his sword to block the attack, and his figure stepped back slightly. In an instant he kicked his legs and rushed forward, directly crashing into the gnoll's arms. A disgusting stench and fishy smell assailed his nostrils. Without hesitation, he stabbed his curved sword into the gnoll's abdomen, then twisted his waist and directly cut a 20-centimeter long wound. A large amount of blood and intestines overflowed. The gnoll was severely injured, but it didn't die. It stuffed its intestines back in with its claws and swung the bone crusher mace again. A throwing knife was thrown. It hit the gnoll's throat in an instant. This was the last straw that broke the enemy's back. The gnoll roared and fell to the ground. Blood and intestines spilled on the ground. The coyote howled and pounced on Soren's leg. Soren twisted his body and kicked the coyote away. Then he used his curved sword to block the coyote's attack from the side. The heavy force forced him to kneel on one knee and deflect the coyote's weapon. At the same time, he twisted his body and stepped forward, cutting a wound on the coyote's leg with his curved sword. Another coyote pounced on him and bit his throat with its bloody mouth. Soren smashed the gnoll's nose with the hilt of his sword. Blood splashed out. Although the wound wasn't fatal, the gnoll howled in pain and retreated. Wolf howls could be heard from afar. It seemed that the gnolls were coming back from their hunt. Soren rushed toward the last gnoll warrior. The wyvern's venom had begun to take effect, and the gnoll's reaction speed had obviously slowed down. Die. Soren slid forward on his knees to avoid the gnoll's mace. He then held his curved sword with both hands and slashed at the gnoll's leg. The gnoll lost its balance. Blood spurted out and one of its legs was cut off. Clang. The smaller she-wolf pounced on Soren and pushed him to the ground. Its sharp fangs were about to bite his throat. However, Soren turned his head in an instant. The she-wolf bit into the leather armor on his shoulder. The sharp fangs pierced through the leather armor, but it didn't hurt the shoulder. It only bit through the skin. Blood splashed. Soren kicked the she-wolf with all his strength. As he kicked the she-wolf away, he held his curved sword and chopped off the head of the gnoll. Swoosh. He calmly reloaded his crossbow and killed the last gnoll guard that crawled over. The gnoll screamed and ran away, but he shot it in the waist. The gnolls in the distance had returned. The sound was about 500 meters away from Soren. He gripped his curved sword tightly and entered the camp. A group of gnolls stared at him fiercely. They let out threatening growls from time to time. Blood splashed. Soren swung his sword and killed 5 gnolls that were less than 2 years old. He then quickly ran into the forest and blended into the shadows. The battle had just begun. He wanted to make the gnolls lose their minds. Only then could he kill more of them. Chapter 59. 1, 2, 3. The gnolls that had gone out to hunt returned to the camp. The strong leader with a scar on his face found the bodies outside and roared angrily. It had fought with adventurers before, and its intelligence as a humanoid creature made it realize that adventurers had attacked their camp. These adventurers had mercilessly slaughtered the descendants of their tribe, just as they had mercilessly eaten the poor humans. There were only a few enemies and they ran away as soon as they noticed their return. 12 gnolls gradually gathered. This was a medium-sized gnoll group. More than half of them were adult gnolls, a third of them were warriors, and a small number of them were newborns. With their talents, they had tamed 3 aardwolves which could be used as helpers when they hunted, and they could also be used as food reserves when they ran out of food. For gnolls, hunger could overwhelm everything. Even the weakest of their kind could be turned into food when they needed it. They were born warriors and scouts, and they could follow the smell of blood. The leader of the gnolls came to the dead body of the female wolf. There was not much difference between males and females in the group, only a difference in size. Male gnolls were usually stronger, and female gnolls would only show some obvious characteristics when they were breastfeeding. It leaned over and sniffed the she-wolf's fangs, which were stained with Sauron's blood. Then it lifted the she-wolf, which weighed 200 to 300 pounds, with one hand and let all the gnolls smell it. They could remember the smell of blood for half a day, and they could follow the smell of blood within a 1-kilometer radius. Revenge. This was the instinct of humanoid creatures. Just like how humans would take revenge for their companions who had been eaten, they would also take revenge for their dead pups. The howls of the wolves rose and fell one after another. The gnolls began to follow the smell of blood. They were not the strongest creatures in the wilderness, but they were definitely the most vicious and annoying ones. The instincts of wolves allowed them to form packs and obey the orders of their own kind. Their innate bestial instincts allowed them to hunt and kill their prey. Adult gnolls had a monster level of 3, and as long as they succeeded in evolving, they would be close to grade 2 warriors. When they moved in packs, they would even hunt more dangerous creatures when they were hungry. The only thing that determined the size of a gnoll group was food. As long as there was enough food, a female wolf could give birth to more than 10 pups in a year. If there was a shortage of food, only the leader had the right to mate. In order to ensure that the strongest offspring would be born, the other Jackalen members would not be able to give birth to offspring, and they would have to raise them together. This was very similar to many wolf packs. In the dense forest, Soren's figure was moving quickly. In the wilderness, only rangers could easily shake off gnolls. They had the ability to track the scent of blood, so it was only a matter of time before they discovered Soren's tracks. These were just gnolls in the material plane. In the outer plane there were even gnolls called bloodthirsters. They could track the smell of blood within a range of 10 kilometers. These creatures were dangerous predators and assassins. Their diet included low-level dragons. A group of jackalans rushed into the forest and followed the scent of blood. Soren needed more favorable terrain. He could face more than 10 kobolds at once, but he could not face more than 10 gnolls at the same time. His stamina was gradually depleted as he ran. Soren's 20 points of constitution ensured his stamina. On the contrary, the gnolls began to slow down after chasing for 1 or 2 kilometers. The dense forest greatly affected one's speed. Even gnolls could not sprint at high speeds. Soren was also affected, but he had the excellent jumping ability and reflexes brought by his dexterity. His sense of balance, which was beyond the limits of a normal person, allowed him to avoid most obstacles. When there was a bush in front of him, he could even jump up and use the tree branches as leverage. It was as if one had been buffed with lightning, while the other had to run on the ground. The terrain in front of him gradually widened, and a mountain peak appeared in front of him. It was a 90-degree cliff, and there were some 3-foot-wide faults. Soren suddenly jumped up and grabbed the rock with both hands to climb up. Just like a climbing madman who challenged the limits of human beings in his previous life, Soren climbed all the way up the cliff with an unusually agile speed, and then stood about 20 meters above the ground. The area where he could move around was very small. He could climb all the way to the top of the mountain from the side. The mountain peak was not very high and there were only bare rocks on top. Soren applied some ointment to the wound on his shoulder, and then began to reload his crossbow. He put the bolts one by one into the small pouch on his waist, where he originally stored throwing knives. The best way to deal with jackalans was to avoid open terrain and be surrounded by them. If a group of jackalans surrounded him, even a high-grade warrior would have to take a few hits, let alone a Tier 2 thief. Traps were only useful in specific areas. Adventurers rarely spent too much time setting up traps in the wilderness. Rogues were more like warriors who relied on their dexterity to fight in the wilderness. This was why there was an advanced branch of the Rogue Blade Master class, which was a very powerful AoE class. The bushes in the distance shook and then a group of strong jackalans came out. The leader was a jackalan with a scar on his face. The scar extended from his forehead to the side of his face. If it had been a little more slanted, his eyes would have been destroyed. They're finally here. Soren hung the crossbow on his waist, and then took out a bloody wolf's head from his multidimensional pouch. It was the head of a jackalan cub. He put it in his pocket before he left. Whoa, whoa, whoa. The howls of the jackalans rose and fell one after another. The jackalan's eyes were bloodshot. They howled and pounced on him, wanting to climb up the wall and tear him to pieces. Taunt successful. Swoosh. A crossbow bolt flew out and the knoll at the front staggered, rolling and hitting the cliff. Soren calmly reloaded the crossbow and then hid behind a rock. He then aimed at the jackalans again and shot an arrow at its head. It hit the skull and the arrow directly nailed into it. A row of data appeared. Killed jackalan warrior. Dealt 36 lethal damage. Target killed. Received 320 slaughter EXP. It had a range of 20 meters. The base damage of the crossbow could reach up to 20, and if it hit a vital point it would instantly kill the target. The jackalans were fast climbers, but it wasn't easy to climb the 90-degree cliff. Before the jackalans could reach him, Soren had already finished reloading the crossbow, and shot an arrow from above. The jackalans that were climbing had no room to dodge. One of them was shot in the neck and fell down, dying in an instant. Another one was shot in the forehead and died on the spot. Whoa! The jackalan's leader howled, and the other jackalans finally realized that the terrain was very unfavorable for them. Some of them hid in the blind spots of Soren's shooting range, while the others flanked Soren from both sides. They climbed up the side of the cliff, preparing to ambush Soren from both sides and from above. Damn it! Their reactions are fast. Soren put away the crossbow. He threw the head of the jackalan pup down and then climbed up the cliff. Although the jackalans weren't very intelligent, they wouldn't just stand there and wait for him to kill them one by one. If the jackalans attacked him, Soren could kill 5 or 6 of them first, but if they surrounded him from the side, he had no choice but to change his position. Soren was able to jump up to the second floor, and his jumping ability was even better than the elves. He jumped up and grabbed onto a rock, then did a 360-degree flip and landed on the top of the cliff. He quickly picked up the crossbow, reloaded it, and shot at the jackalans that were climbing up the cliff. The jackalans were alert enough to dodge, and the crossbow hit a rock. Clang. Soren wasn't surprised. He pulled out his scimitar, looked at the jackalans that were surrounding him, and rushed towards the closest one. The terrain here was good. If the jackalans were grouped together, he could slowly kill them. If they were scattered, he could kill them alone. At least he didn't have to face 3 or 5 of them at once. It was a pity that he didn't have the forest walk ability, or he would be able to kill them in the forest. The Elven Ranger's favorite thing to do was to jump from tree to tree and kill enemies with their longbows. A jackalan gave him nearly 300 slaughter EXP, and he would be able to take out half of them. Chapter 60. I woke up at 6 o'clock and dreamt of many recommendation tickets. Please vote for me. Thank you. Clang. Soren jumped down from the 5-meter-tall rock and slashed at the Knoll warrior's head. The Knoll blocked the scimitar with its weapon, but was forced to take 2 steps back from the impact. It lost its balance and lost its balance. Soren didn't care about the numbness in his legs. He lunged forward and slashed at the Knoll's chest. Blood splattered out and landed on his face. The smell of blood stimulated Soren's thirst for battle. He kicked the Knoll in the ass and the Knoll's whole body twitched. He slid down and stabbed forward. Soren stabbed his scimitar into the Knoll's chest and kicked it down the cliff. The Knoll's tenacious life force was still struggling in midair. It fell to the ground with a thud and died. Soren sheathed his scimitar. He glanced at the Knolls that were getting closer and closer. He grabbed onto a rock and prepared to escape. Clang. The sound of wind breaking could be heard behind him. One of the Knolls saw that it couldn't catch up to Soren and threw its weapon at him. It almost hit him in the head. Knolls couldn't use long-range weapons with their claws, so apart from a small number of advanced scouts, most of them used close-range weapons. Soren judged the direction and rolled down the cliff. When 3 to 5 Knolls reached the top, he was already halfway up the mountain. Swoosh. He calmly reloaded his crossbow and hit another Knoll in the eye. However, the other Knoll only hit its arm. The Knoll howled and pulled the crossbow out. Soren wasn't in a hurry to win. He was taking advantage of the Knolls because they weren't as agile as he was and they didn't have his 20 points of vitality. The Knolls that had been chasing after them all the way to the top of the mountain were already panting heavily. Although they looked furious, there was nothing they could do to Soren. This was because the despicable human in front of them didn't even fight them head-on. He only used the distance and the terrain to shoot at them with his crossbow. Fly a kite. Heavy armor warriors hated this way of fighting the most. Because the movement speed of the heavy armor was not fast, it was very easy for the enemy to kill him with long-range weapons. If you chase him, he will run. If you run, he will chase after you. Soren maintained a distance of at least 15 meters between the two of them. Even if they split up and surrounded him, there was still enough space for him to move around on the bare mountaintop. Gnolls were humanoid creatures. They did not have the jumping ability of werewolves, but their strength and speed were higher than that of ordinary people. Soren didn't care about him at all. He quickly reloaded his crossbow and fired at the other 3 jackals who were running over aggressively. A blood-curdling scream rang out. One of the gnolls was hit in the chest and the other 2 gnolls were enraged. They didn't care about the terrain and directly charged at Soren. They even wanted to hug him and roll down the cliff. In an instant, Soren lowered his waist and dodged the gnolls by a hair's breadth. The gnolls that were charging at him screamed and fell down the cliff. The 2 or 3 gnolls gradually approached. Soren put away his crossbow expressionlessly, then pulled out his scimitar and rushed in the direction of one of the gnolls. Faced with the Bone Crusher mace, he twisted his body and dodged it. The sharp shards of the Bone Crusher mace scratched his back, leaving a bloody gash. But he also dodged the attack at the same time. He twisted his scimitar and cut a wound under the gnoll's arm. Bang! The mace hit a rock and debris flew everywhere. Soren kicked up the dust with his foot, then dove down and chopped at the gnoll's waist. The gnoll's skull was very hard. It couldn't be pierced without a crossbow, and the scimitar couldn't be used to suppress the gnoll's strength. Blood and intestines spilled all over the ground. The gnoll that was enraged didn't care about the wound on its waist. It opened its mouth and bit at Soren's neck. Bang! Soren held his scimitar with both hands and twisted it. When the gnoll's bloody mouth was getting closer and closer, he gritted his teeth and let out a roar, then rammed into the gnoll's head. Several teeth flew out, and Soren rammed his head into the gnoll's head. While he was a little dizzy from the impact, the gnoll's face was also covered in blood. Soren's extraordinary physique was on full display. He was only dizzy for less than a second before he recovered. He pulled out his scimitar and chopped off a gnoll's head. Blood dripped down from his forehead. The gnoll's teeth had scratched his forehead, and the wound was about an inch long. It was simple and brutal. Technique wasn't about how many tricks you could play. It was about how you used the most direct and effective way to fight in a moment of life and death. Blood dripped down from the corner of his eyes. The gnoll's blood had splashed into his eye sockets. Soren's eyes were red. He wiped his eyes with his hand, then took a deep breath and held his scimitar. He stood still and waited. There weren't many gnolls left. He had just killed 7 or 8, and the enraged gnoll leader was already charging at him. As long as he could kill it, the gnolls would quickly crumble. The continuous battles had already consumed a lot of his stamina. There was no point in continuing to run. He still had 5 shadow strikes that he hadn't used yet. They were spells that ignored physical defense, and they were more than enough for him to kill the gnoll leader in a short amount of time. Soren's figure was a little hazy in the shadows. When the enraged gnoll leader appeared, he pounced at it like a cheetah. Clang! The gnoll leader blocked Soren's scimitar with its mace, but the invisible energy corroded its arm, and its flesh was stained with a dark gray color. Shadow strikes. As long as it came into contact with the target, it would deal energy damage that ignored physical defense. 6 points of shadow strike damage wasn't enough to kill, but it was enough to change the enemy's attack rhythm. Soren slashed down with his scimitar. As he attacked, he also activated the shadow energy within his body. This was a spell-like ability that could fuse with the shadow energy. Could even transform a thief into a half-shadow supernatural being. Clang! The gnoll leader blocked Soren's attack again, but its body couldn't help but tremble. The shadow energy continued to corrode the target, and 12 points of shadow strike damage was equivalent to a cut. It finally noticed the strange energy in Soren's attack, and retreated when Soren swung his scimitar at it again. The condensed shadow energy dissipated, and Soren could only use shadow strikes twice. The shadow energy didn't take long to gather, and if it didn't reach the target, it would quickly dissipate. The gnolls nearby were already charging at him. Soren could even hear the howls of the gnolls behind him. Sword form, heavy slash. Soren's muscles tightened, and he focused all his strength into a single line. In an instant he jumped and slashed. The gnoll leader's wrist was cut off, and then he twisted his body and swung his scimitar horizontally at its head. Blood spurted out like a fountain, and the gnoll leader's head was directly cut off. The headless corpse raised its mace and wobbled for a moment before falling to the ground with a thump. Brr. Soren picked up the gnoll leader's head with one hand and let out a deafening roar at the approaching gnolls. The wild roar echoed throughout the mountaintop. The gnolls nearby froze and then they bared their fangs and howled. Their eyes were still fierce, but there was a hint of fear in them. Soren used all his strength to let out another roar, and then he raised the gnoll leader's head high up in the air. He looked around fiercely and once again tightened his grip on his scimitar. Woo woo woo. Like a frightened wolf, the gnoll's howls suddenly became much quieter. They looked at the few gnolls nearby and finally felt fear. They turned around and fled into the forest. They were scared. Soren looked at the gnolls who had lost their morale and ran away. He casually threw away the gnoll leader's head, then sat down on the ground and laughed a little nervously. Although the battle had only lasted for about 10 minutes, the high intensity of the battle had already made his hands tremble. If the gnoll's morale hadn't collapsed, he would have had to use his ultimate move. Injury for injury. The drow instructor in the Underdark told him that unless he was prepared to die, it was best not to use it. It was a combat skill that drow assassins would only use when they were on a mission where they had to die. As if remembering his experience in the Underdark, Soren's face once again laughed nervously, then he patted the dust off his face and stood up. He was one of the top violent thieves in the Underdark. Many people thought that he should be a blade master or a berserker instead of a lurker. But only he knew that in those extremely dangerous places, whether it was the Underdark or the Abyss, where demons were everywhere, a warrior could never live as freely as a rogue. A row of data appeared. The battle is over. After a difficult battle, your skills have improved. You have successfully used Taunt on the gnolls. You have successfully used Intimidate on the gnolls. Intimidate +10, Taunt +5, Evasion roll, +2 Evasion shift, +1 parry +1 survival +2. You have mastered the combat skill, sword form, heavy hack. Chapter 61. 3,950 Slaughter EXP. Even after deducting the 900 EXP he got from killing the kobolds, each advanced gnoll warrior still gave Soren close to 300 Slaughter EXP. These monsters were born with a monster level of 3 and a profession level of 1 or 2, so the Slaughter EXP they got was 10 times more than the kobolds. Of course, it was also more difficult to deal with them. Soren used half a bottle of wyvern venom on them, and it could only last one more battle before it was used up. There was nothing to gain from the gnolls and the broken weapons were worthless. After resting for a while, Soren headed towards the gnoll's nest. He didn't want to let go of the loot, and the group of gnolls that he scared away probably didn't dare to go back. Soon he arrived near the nest. The gnolls that ran away didn't come back. These gnolls would become wanderers in the wilderness until they were accepted into the tribe by stronger gnolls. The smell in the nest was terrible and it was filled with a pungent stench and the smell of blood. Soren saw many skeletons of beasts, humans and humanoid creatures. There were also traces of bonfires nearby. The gnolls collected their loot in a very messy way and many of them were stained with blood. He even saw some human skins. The gnolls used the skins of their prey to make simple leather armor. There were many weapons in the nest, and it seemed that they had attacked humans before. Of course, they wouldn't have brought such ordinary weapons. Soren only took out the kindler. There were also some ordinary goods, probably from the caravans that they attacked in the past. There weren't many valuable items. In the end he found about 100 kindler and 1 or 2 amber stones. What a surprise. These gnolls didn't even have as much money as the kobold sorcerers. Soren washed his hands unhappily, and then put the valuable items in the bag. There was no way he could bring the goods and weapons with him. They were too heavy and he couldn't fit them in the bag. When he returned at night, he would tell the village that maybe they would be interested in sending someone to take them away. These were all daily necessities and they could use them if he brought them back. Soren was ready to leave. But just as he was about to leave, a light caught his attention. He carefully pried open the stone wall with his scimitar, and found a gem hidden inside. Shit. Soren couldn't help but curse. He took out the gem, held it in his hand and looked at it under the sun. He immediately said, I didn't expect these guys to have such a good thing. They really hid it well. It was a pink diamond. It was only half the size of a fingernail and had not been polished. If it was not for the light that attracted Soren's attention, he would have missed it. Some businessmen would buy this kind of unpolished diamond and bring it back after making money. Firstly, they could carry it with them, which was more discreet than carrying a large amount of gold dirhams. Secondly, they could earn another sum of money after returning to their hometown. Soren. Probably worth 500 or 600 kindler? Soren had never studied the price of diamonds before, but they had always been expensive. Normal diamonds cost about 200 or 300 Kindler dollars, and pink diamonds cost about twice as much. This was just a raw diamond that had not been polished. After polishing, it would definitely be smaller, but its value should not be less than 500 Kindler coins. Soren put away the pink diamond with a smile. Even though he had looted quite a few valuable items from the corpses of the dwarven adepts, it wasn't convenient for him to sell them. Even a low-grade sorcerer's ring was hard to buy. Whether it was for Vivian or himself, it was a life-saving item. As for the other things such as the Shadow Tentacle spell scroll, they shouldn't be sold. Although he couldn't use it now, copying scrolls wasn't easy at all. Just the basic materials required could reach hundreds of Kindler coins. And it wasn't a 100% success rate. If he didn't count the items he looted from the corpses of the dwarven adepts, Soren's total earnings would only add up to 300 or 400 Kindler coins, which was barely enough to buy 1 or 2 rare items. Of course, they would only be low-grade rare items. Even the high-grade ones were frighteningly expensive. Soren looked around again to make sure he didn't miss anything valuable. Only then did he quickly leave the knoll nest. It was getting late. If he didn't want to camp in the wilderness, it would be best for him to go back now. He should be able to return to the village before nightfall. He would then have a good night's rest and go check out the place where the ogres appeared the next day. Those creatures were even more dangerous than the gnolls. Ogres had a monster level of 5, and most of them had advanced professions. Most of them were warriors, while a few of them could become wizards or sorcerers. If they retained their totemic beliefs, the ogre tribes could even nurture shamans. In fact, they were another type of priest, but they didn't worship gods. Ogre shamans rarely appeared in the wilderness, and they usually played an important role in the tribe. Ogres had a monster level of 6, and there were about 3 to 5 of them in the wilderness. If there was a chance, Soren would try to kill them. If the enemy was too strong, he would give up on his target and move on. Ogre Strength Bracers. This item represented how dangerous they were. An adult ogre had at least 18 points of strength, and if they evolved, they would have 20 points of strength. They could also wield weapons that weighed more than 100 pounds. With Soren's current strength, he wouldn't die if he took a few hits from the gnolls, but if he took a hit from the ogres, he would be dead meat. The only obvious weakness was that the ogres were born slow, and their attack speed wasn't fast. If there weren't many of them, he could rely on his agility to dodge their attacks. Under normal circumstances, adventurers would rather face a large group of gnolls than a small group of ogres. This was because even a strength-type shield warrior would be injured by the ogre's attacks. Ogres loved heavy weapons, and even full body armor was useless. Against these creatures, one couldn't let them get hit. Wherever they hit, they would break. If they were unlucky, it was normal to lose an arm or a leg. Among all the attributes, strength was the one that had the biggest impact on the enemy's damage. Therefore, most of the creatures with higher strength would be harder to challenge, and this was even more so when fighting against the gigantic humans. Soren had experienced this when he hunted down a hill giant. He accidentally brushed against one of the giants, and his arm was broken on the spot. The bone was broken in half, and he used up all his savings to ask a priest to fix the broken bone. However, in the end he managed to kill the hill giant and finally avenged himself. The night was hazy. Soren went back the way he came, and when he returned to the village, he immediately noticed that the atmosphere was not right. The fully armed militia was guarding the area, and many of them had lit torches. When they saw someone approaching, they immediately drew their bows and let out a sigh of relief when they saw that it was Soren. What happened? Soren walked into the village and asked, "What happened?" The militia captain walked out with a serious expression. He glanced at Soren and said in a deep voice, "Lizardmen. The lizard men from the swamp are here. They are well armed and they ambushed our patrol team. We suffered heavy losses. 2 died and 5 were injured." Soren's expression suddenly became serious. He looked around and said, "How many people do you have left? Don't count the normal people. You have to be well-equipped and trained warriors." The militia captain hesitated for a moment and said slowly, "There are 30 more. But we still have a lot of adult men in the village. They can fight with weapons." "That's too little." Soren frowned and looked at him and said in a deep voice, "This is not enough to deal with the lizardmen. I suggest you move to another place as soon as possible." Chapter 62. Lizardmen. They were one of the most annoying creatures in the swamp. Their numbers were huge, and although they were not as strong as the gnolls, they outnumbered the gnolls by more than 10 times. Basically, a small group of lizard men would have 100 or 200 of them. Once a battle broke out, they would send out dozens or even hundreds of warriors. Most adventurers would not provoke them. There was at least one spellcaster in a lizard man group, either a warlock or a droll. These spellcasters were proficient in taming and enslaving monsters. They could not cast many spells, but they could bring some swamp beasts with them. For example, the swamp lizard. It was a monster with a challenge rating of 6. It was 5 meters long and weighed about 1,500 pounds. Can you help us? The girl from last night came over with red eyes. She looked at Soren with hope and said, "You're an adventurer. They all said that you're very strong. You must have a way to deal with these lizard men, right?" Soren shook his head and said seriously, "I'm sorry. I don't have a way. There are a lot of them and there are many archers. The warriors can't stop them. If we don't leave, they'll kill everyone in the village." Lizard men were similar to humans. They grew some food and hunting was their main source of meat. Their settlements were a bit like villages, and they were either dug-out caves or simple huts. Human villages in the wilderness had at least a few hundred people, and these lizard men also had a few hundred people. However, there were not many warriors among the humans, but more than 50% of the lizard men were warriors. They also had a lot of archers. Dealing with these creatures was not something that could be done alone. At the very least, there was no one with a high enough profession level to be unparalleled in the crowd. If there was a warrior with a profession level of 15 or above, or a spellcaster with a profession level of 12 or above, let him deal with 50 to 100 lizard men alone, and leave the rest to the others. It should be possible to repel these lizard men. The lizard men were forced to move out of the Black Swamp. Any place near the water could become their new target. This was a battle for survival and the process was very cruel. Peaceful coexistence was an extravagant hope. In the end, there would inevitably be a winner who would divide the territory. Human villages would fight over water sources for irrigation, and there would even be deaths, not to mention this kind of interracial territorial competition. Originally, there were tens of millions of Indians living in America, but in the end, less than 1/10 of them were slaughtered. Tens of millions of people were slaughtered in the process. This was only a battle between humans. If the differences between different races were taken into account, the process would be even more bloody. The lizard men would kill all humans including women and children. This world was very bloody and dark. There was no need to have too many illusions about the level of civilization. Humans had also walked this path step by step. Soren wouldn't risk his life for them. He didn't have the ability and it wasn't worth it. He could only give his own suggestions. It was up to them whether they wanted to leave or not. They had to bear the consequences themselves. Perhaps because of the lizardmen's attack, the militia captain forgot to arrange a place for him to stay. Soren didn't care. He went to the woodshed to rest. Outside, double the number of patrols were arranged. The militia captain was discussing with the village elders whether they should move or not. Leaving home was a very difficult choice. There was a debate between them, but Soren wasn't interested in getting involved. There was a limit to his personal strength if he wasn't at the legendary level. He could deal with a few lizard men, but he couldn't do anything more. So he planned to leave tomorrow and continue to observe the situation. Out of vigilance against the lizard men, Soren didn't fall asleep. He closed his eyes and pretended to sleep. They might attack at night. The night was getting darker. Soren didn't fall asleep. He was only in a half-awake state. Suddenly he heard the sound of something falling to the ground. He instantly opened his eyes and climbed up from the haystack. Clang. Soren unsheathed his curved sword and then walked out of the house. There were torches outside. Because of the attack during the day, the militia was on high alert. He could also hear the sound of night patrols. In this situation, even he didn't have much confidence in sneaking in, so he couldn't help but feel a little relieved. However, because of his constant vigilance, Soren still walked along the house to the fence. He didn't see any traces of the lizard men. There were also torches on the side. There were always people guarding the watchtower. It was very difficult to sneak in. What is this? Just as Soren was about to go back to sleep, he suddenly stopped. He bent down and looked at the ground. There was a little wet mark on it. It was relatively dry these 2 days and there was no rain. The ground nearby was dry, but this area was a little wet. He carefully picked up the soil and smelled it. There was a faint fishy smell. It seemed to be left behind by something. Lizard men? Soren's hair stood on end. He rolled over and leaned his back against the wall. He held his curved sword in front of his chest and said, "Lurker? Lizard men lurker." Only advanced lurkers could sneak in without anyone noticing. When they reached 100 points in sneak, they could cast invisibility in the shadows. It was very difficult to see them with the naked eye. Not good. Soren ran towards the watchtower. He was afraid that some lizard-men lurkers had already sneaked in. Bang! Suddenly, a muffled sound came from behind him. Then a woman shouted, "Not good. The warehouse is on fire." Her voice spread throughout the entire village. The patrolling guards and the militia near the watchtower were stunned. Immediately, someone ran over to put out the fire. Shit. Soren didn't think that the lizard men would know to set the fire first. He almost didn't think about it and shouted, "Enemy attack! There are lizard men outside." In the blink of an eye. Suddenly, the sound of a bowstring vibrating could be heard in the night. Then the guard on the watchtower trembled and fell to the ground. An arrow shot out from the darkness and directly pierced through his leather armor. It went through his chest and into his heart, killing him on the spot. Longbowman. Soren immediately hid in the shadows. The lizard men had trained longbowmen. The leather armor of the militia was like paper in front of a longbow. The ordinary militia was obviously a little panicked. However, the retired adventurers quickly reacted and began to gather others to defend. They had a lot of combat experience. Although they had said goodbye to their adventuring careers, they were not at a loss. Bang! 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 A muffled sound came from outside the door. Then a young man shouted in horror, "Ogre! Ogre!" Soren's mood suddenly sank to the bottom. He held his curved sword tightly and took a deep breath. Then he sneaked behind him. The village might not be able to hold on. If necessary, he had to think of a way to break out. The most important thing now was not to deal with the lizard men and ogres outside, but to kill the lurkers that had sneaked in. These enemies that could hide in the shadows were the most dangerous things. If they were allowed to sneak up on him, he wouldn't even need to wait for the outside to break out. The inside would be completely chaotic. "I didn't expect to meet my peers so soon." Soren's expression was serious. He quietly moved along the corner of the wall. His figure was blurry in the shadows. He held his curved sword tightly and moved forward slowly. At the same time, he was paying attention to the ground around him. The lurkers couldn't be seen clearly with the naked eye. When they were in stealth mode, they had the effect of invisibility. One could only determine their position through some special signs, such as the footprints on the ground and the slight movements they made when they moved. Soren had fought with his peers more than once or twice. As long as they left a trace, he would be able to find out where they were. The whole village was in a panic. There were screams of women and children, and there were also shouts of adult men. The long-term training of the militia finally had some effect. Many adult men picked up their weapons and gathered together. The fire in the warehouse was getting bigger and bigger. Suddenly, the light in front of the burning fire was distorted. It was as if a hazy figure had appeared and disappeared. Soren instantly rushed out like a cheetah. The curved sword in his hand directly slashed at the empty air in front of him. Blood splattered everywhere. Some kind of creature that looked like a hybrid of a lizard and a human showed its trace. Chapter 63. Die. Soren retracted his sword and thrust forward. Relying on the explosive power of his body, he directly pounced on the lizard-man lurker's body. A fishy smell assaulted his nostrils, but Soren's expression did not change as he thrust his sword into the lizard-man lurker's body, nailing it to the ground. The lizard-man lurker's body lost its balance in an instant, rendering it powerless to resist. The moment it fell to the ground, Soren struck the lizard-man lurker's heart. It was only when the lizard-man lurker's body stopped twitching that Soren slowly got up. The battle here had attracted a lot of attention. Soren pulled out his curved sword and shouted, "What are you waiting for? Go and defend the front." There should be another lizard-man lurker. There were quite a few creatures that could become rogues, but becoming a lurker required a lot of talent. There shouldn't be too many lizard men who had such talent. However, as soon as he heard the commotion, there was a huge fire. There were probably about 2 enemies that had snuck in. They needed someone to help them to set the warehouse on fire. The fire spread quickly, and there were at least 2 or 3 places where the fire was set. Soren once again hid in the shadows. Lizard men had a natural bonus to strength and dexterity. Although their intelligence was not high, their average stats were higher than humans. If the average strength and dexterity of a human was 10, then the average strength and dexterity of a lizard man was 12. The lurkers of the lizard men were quite talented. He had just caught the enemy off guard, and now the enemy should be prepared. It would not be so easy to launch a surprise attack again. What would a lurker do in a situation like this? Soren looked at the fire around him and did not find any signs of lurkers. He thought for a moment and then approached the door. A lurker's assassination ability was very strong. The purpose of setting the fire to disturb the enemy had been achieved. The crying women and children had obviously interfered with the militia's battle. Assassinating the weak women and children was meaningless. In this case, the most likely target of a lurker was the leader of the village, who was the commander of the militia. As long as the commander was lost, the enemy would fight on their own. There was even a possibility that they would directly collapse and assassinate the commander of the militia. The village would be completely finished. Some lizard men had already climbed over the fence. They were so agile that the wooden fence could not stop them. After landing on the ground, the lizard men began to attack the militia guards. Some of them directly rushed to the rear and slaughtered the old, weak women and children. This made many of the militia guards so angry that their eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Some even wanted to rush to the rear to protect their wives and children. Bastard! Soren kicked down a militia that was charging at him and roared, "Do you want everyone to die here? Hurry up and fight at the front. Leave these monsters to me." He quickly took out his crossbow and fired. The arrow hit the lizardman warrior's back, and then he jumped forward and chopped off the lizardman's head. The hideous head fell to the ground, and the woman holding the child in her arms screamed in fear. "Shut up." With a slap in the face, Soren slapped the woman directly, and her cheeks swelled up on the spot. He kicked a long sword in front of the woman, picked her up from the ground and roared, "Don't cry. If you don't want your son to be disemboweled and eaten by the lizardmen, pick up your weapon and fight now. Do you know how to cut people?" The woman was stunned by Soren's slap. She looked at Soren's ferocious expression and was so scared that her legs almost gave out. But when she heard Soren's vicious words, her expression quickly changed. She looked down at the crying child. Her hands trembled as she gripped the long sword tightly. Her expression was twisted, and she directly cut the lizardman's corpse. Blood splattered everywhere, and she gritted her teeth and said, "Yes. Go and gather the others." Soren quickly reloaded the crossbow, then looked at the trembling woman in front of him and roared, "Get them to find weapons. Use your swords to cut, use your hands to grab, and use your teeth to bite. There's a group of hungry ogres outside, and they like to eat the tender children first. If you don't want to watch them eat your children, go and fight now." The vicious words caused the woman's expression to become even more twisted. Her maternal instincts were awakened by the cruel words, and her expression became resolute. She was like a warrior who had already decided to die. She gripped the long sword in her hand tightly. Her long years of working in the fields had given her strength that was not weaker than a man's. The woman pulled her child up and shouted to the people nearby. At the same time, she asked the others to gather around her. Very good. Sometimes, vicious words were more effective than heroic encouragement. Soren's expression also became ferocious. The lizardmen warriors that rushed in were slashing and killing, and in just a short while more than 10 people had fallen to the ground. Most of them were old, weak women and children who had no ability to resist. He suddenly jumped onto the roof, determined the position of a lizardman warrior, and then jumped down from the sky. Die. With an angry roar, Soren held the sword with both hands and slashed diagonally at the lizardman's neck. Due to the inertia of the fall, the lizardman's head and half of its shoulder were cut off. He breathed heavily as he kicked the weapon in front of a woman he met during the day. His eyes were slightly bloodshot and he said in a deep voice, "If you don't want to die, then pick up your weapons and fight." Soren didn't have time to lecture them one by one. He had already used all his strength to shout at the beginning. Everyone nearby could hear him. If this still didn't awaken their desire to fight, then they could only wait for the merciless slaughter. The woman with freckles on her face trembled as she picked up her sword. She opened her mouth to say something, but Soren's figure had already left. He rushed towards another lizard man that rushed in. The young woman took a deep breath, then gripped her weapon tightly and rushed towards the others who had gathered. There were no men or women in this battle. There were only the living and the dead. Soren didn't care about saving ammunition. He loaded his poison crossbow and shot 5 or 6 lizard men in succession. The wyvern's venom paralyzed their bodies. They were killed by the women who had no chance of defeating them. The crazy women tore the lizard men into pieces. The enemies they killed awakened their courage and made them realize that they could also fight. There were still lizard men warriors that were left behind. However, Soren didn't have the energy to care about them. He ran forward, looking for traces of the lurkers. These invisible enemies were like daggers on his back. Soren couldn't fight in peace if he didn't kill them. Everyone in the village was mobilized. The people who lived in the wilderness often encountered monsters. Although they lacked training, they were not completely defenseless. As long as they had the courage to fight, they would be able to kill these lizard men even if they had to sacrifice their lives. Over there. Soren's body that was rushing forward paused, and he threw out the curved sword in his hand. Behind the militia captain, the air suddenly distorted. A lizard man lurker appeared and stabbed at his back with a pitch-black dagger. The blade could pierce through the heart from the back, killing the target in an instant. However, the lizardman's body suddenly stiffened, and its attack was diverted. It only managed to scratch the militia captain's back. The militia captain's battle instincts made him quickly turn around and cut off the lizardman's head with his long sword. Soren jumped up and pulled out his scimitar. He didn't even wait for the militia captain to thank him before he shouted, "The village gate can't hold. Archers! Archers, aim at the ogres." The ogres were born with 18 points of strength. They could use weapons that weighed more than 100 pounds. Almost no one in the village could take their attacks head-on. If the ogres were to rush in, the militia's defensive formation would collapse in an instant. Ogres rarely wore heavy armor. The best way to kill them was to use the archers. Bang! The gate of the village was smashed open in the next moment. 3 ferocious-looking ogres, each standing 3 meters tall and weighing over 500 pounds, rushed in. They held spiked maces that were as thick as an adult's thigh in their hands. The moment they rushed in, they smashed out. One of the militiamen used his shield to block the attack. The powerful force shattered the wooden shield and sent him flying 3 to 4 meters away. He fell to the ground and twitched a little. Soon he stopped breathing. His chest was completely caved in. Supernatural power. Soren's expression was ugly as he held something in his hand. Chapter 64. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. The militia reacted quickly and fired a volley of arrows at the ogres. There were many hunters in the villages near the wilderness, and hunting was their main source of meat. But the problem was that hunters mostly used short bows and hard bows, and their damage was far less than longbowmen. Even if they were shooting at close range, the arrows still couldn't deal any fatal damage to the ogres. On the contrary, they even provoked the ogres to go berserk. The ogres used their thick arms to shield their heads. 2 arrows hit their arms and a few more hit their bodies. They wore simple leather armor and had a thick layer of fat on their bodies. It wouldn't be a problem even if they were hit 10 more times. On the contrary, their skin turned slightly red after they went berserk, and their attacks became even fiercer. A Tier 2 ogre warrior would automatically learn a spell-like ability, and that was the Bloodlust that many people were familiar with. Or perhaps it should be called Bloodlust Rage. Although these ogres weren't Tier 2 yet, they already had the ability to go berserk. Ogres had a monster level of 5, and when a warrior reached Tier 2, they would reach a total level of 15. They could turn into a berserk killing machine. "Get out of the way." The militia captain roared and shouted at a middle-aged man beside him, "Kalat. Milos." White Raven formation. Following the militia captain's roar, 2 militia members who were obviously stronger rushed over. At the same time, with their roars, their muscles expanded as if they were inflated. Their temples bulged slightly, and the veins and blood vessels on their arms could be seen. Whether it was the strength or speed of their attacks, both increased by a lot. It was almost as fast as Soren's heavy slash, or a raising slash. This was the ability of a Tier 2 warrior. It could stimulate one's potential and maximize one's strength for a short period of time. Although it could only last for 1 or 2 minutes, the damage it could deal was several times more than usual. This ability was usually used by Tier 2 warriors when they were desperate. They could only activate it once a day, and the duration was determined by their physique. However, it wouldn't last more than 2 minutes. White Raven formation. Soren was surprised for a moment, but he quickly grabbed his scimitar and wandered around. He was very familiar with the famous White Raven tactic. The White Raven sword art was a high-level combat skill. If 2 people were to use it together, they would be able to form a web of attacks. If 3 or more people were to use it together, they would be able to form a small team formation. Such combat skills were rarely seen among ordinary adventurers. The 3 people in front of him seemed to have participated in wars. Only the army would train in the White Raven formation. The White Raven sword style consumed a lot of stamina. The 3 middle-aged militiamen formed an inverted triangle as they moved forward. The long swords in their hands glinted coldly as they coordinated their attacks. In just 30 seconds they had killed 5 to 6 lizard men. This sudden burst of lethality greatly boosted the courage of the others, and at the same time, it also attracted the attention of the lizard men. Just as they were about to concentrate on killing the ogres, the sound of a bowstring vibrating could be heard. Longbowman? A cold glint flashed in Soren's eyes as he leaped into the air. He kicked off the railing with the tip of his foot and leaped 6 or 7 meters into the air. His 20 points of extraordinary dexterity exploded at this moment. In a flash, he took out his crossbow and fired blindly at the longbowman. The short time he was in midair didn't allow him to lock onto the target's position. He could only rely on his vision and intuition to make a counterattack. 2 screams could be heard. One of them was a middle-aged man who was in the White Raven formation. One of them was shot in the abdomen, and his reflexes were slowed by half a beat. His head was smashed by an ogre and white brain matter splattered everywhere. The scene was so shocking that it made the surroundings quiet down. Then a young man's heart-wrenching scream could be heard. The dead middle-aged man was his father. The other scream came from outside. Soren had successfully shot the lizard men longbowman. Although he didn't know if it was a vital point, the poison on the arrow was enough to make it lose its ability to fight. The longbow required a lot of strength from the human body. Although its lethality was top-notch, its power would plummet after being injured. At most, the enemy could only rely on their will to shoot once or twice. Longbowmen were a very precious fighting profession, and the lizard men had never exposed them to the battlefield. Bang! A dull thud could be heard from the ground. The militia captain cooperated with the White Raven formation to kill an ogre, but as the time to activate Chi/Slash ran out, his explosive power began to plummet. When he used his long sword to cut open an ogre's abdomen, his reflexes were half a beat too slow, and he was hit in the arm. His arm was instantly twisted, and he didn't even need to look to know that the bones were completely broken. Without a priest to cast divine spells, he would be crippled after he recovered, and he would never be able to lift heavy objects again. Thump, thump, thump. The morale that had just recovered quickly fell. Half of the militia had died, and although there were still many adult men and hunters in the village, they didn't have much of an advantage against the lizard men. If there were no accidents, the village would be breached in a short period of time. Then the lizard men would charge in and start a massacre. The ogres would also eat their fill and pack up the food to bring back. The lizard men must have paid a certain price to make these ogres attack. The young men in the village tried their best to save the militia captain, but everyone's eyes were filled with despair. The scales of victory were tilted towards the enemy. Soren's face was also very ugly. There were many lizard men and there were also some archers outside. If he tried to break through, he might be trapped outside. The militia had already begun to shrink their formation. Many of them were trembling as they held their weapons and retreated bit by bit. It was already very difficult to defend the village gate, and if they continued to stay here, they would only be surrounded by the lizard men. At that time, as long as they occupied the high ground, the archers would be able to kill them all. Heavy footsteps could be heard. The lizard men temporarily slowed down their attack, and then a dark green lizard that weighed about half a ton appeared. On its back was a shriveled and wrinkled lizard mandrill. It was holding a withered cane made of vines, and there was even a young leaf growing out of it. Among all the droll, only the lizard men could easily recruit a swamp lizard as their animal companion. Entangle. The lizard mandrill threw out something that looked like a dandelion seed. In an instant, vines grew out of the ground in a 15-meter radius. These vines wrapped around the legs of the others and in an instant they were trapped in place. Some of the weaker ones were directly tied up by the vines, and couldn't even move their arms that were holding weapons. However, there were still some people who were lucky enough to avoid it. Or rather, they were prepared in advance. Soren had already jumped out of the way before the droll cast his spell, and at the same time, he swung his curved sword to cut off the vines. Entangle was the droll's most common starting spell, so there was no way he wouldn't be prepared for it. But what they didn't expect was that although Soren had successfully dodged the vines, he had become the main target of the lizard mandrill. It raised its hand and threw out a dark green powder and quickly cast a spell. Plague. Soren's arm instantly became red and swollen, and then the exposed skin on his body bulged with pus within a few seconds. The wound began to fester and pus dripped down along his wrist. He almost couldn't hold the curved sword anymore. A row of data appeared. You've been affected by plague. Plague test of death activated. Enhanced vitality is in effect. You've successfully passed the test of death. You've received 18 plague damage and will be affected by plague for the next 15 minutes. The fallen withered of the droll. Soren looked at the pustules on his arm with a ferocious expression. He was about to break out of the encirclement, but he suddenly stopped. Even if he had to leave, he had to kill the lizard man droll in front of him first. If it didn't die, the militia here would quickly collapse, and it would be difficult for him to break out of the encirclement. You think you're the only one who can cast spells? Soren roared and took out a spell scroll and immediately said, "Pay 2500 slaughter EXP. Profession wizard." A wave of elemental energy appeared, and Soren instantly felt as if there was a magic network in the dark. He tore open the spell scroll and immediately, a burst of shadow energy burst out. Rogues couldn't use high-grade scrolls without enough skill, but wizards didn't have such restrictions. As long as they used mana to activate the spell model on the scroll, they could directly use spell scrolls that exceeded their own profession level. Shadow Tentacles, 4th Circle. Chapter 65. 3 pitch-black tentacles broke out of the ground. They were about the size of a baby's arm, but they were about 30 feet long. The tentacles were made entirely out of shadow energy and wrapped around the monsters in an instant. The first monster to be wrapped around was the ogre. The moment the tentacles touched it, the ogre froze on the spot like a wooden puppet. The power of a level 3 fireball was equivalent to a howitzer, so a level 4 shadow tentacle wasn't as simple as it looked. The highly condensed shadow energy had a paralyzing effect. Any creature touched by the tentacles would have to undergo a test of endurance, or else they would be paralyzed for a few seconds. Although the ogre's strength was high, their vitality wasn't much higher than a human's. Normally, it was around 15 points, so they only had a 50% chance of passing the test of endurance. The tentacles wrapped around the ogre under Soren's control. The 30 feet long tentacles wrapped around the ogre's neck and slowly tightened. Shadow Tentacles, Spell Casting. Circle 4 summon 3 to 6 energy tentacles within 100 feet. You can use your mind to control them to attack enemies. The energy tentacles can be up to 50 feet long. Any target that comes into contact with them must undergo a test of endurance. Otherwise, they will be paralyzed for a few seconds by the shadow energy. The tentacles have a base strength of 15. Every point of spell power increases the caster's strength by 1, up to a maximum of 25 points of strength. Each point of spell power increases the caster's duration by 6 seconds. Soren's intelligence was 18 points. After his subclass, he had a wizard level 1 spell power of 1 point, and his 18 points of intelligence gave him 4 spell power. In other words, the shadow tentacles had 20 points of strength and could last for 30 seconds. Although 30 seconds wasn't a long time, it was enough to decide the life and death of both sides. Crack. The first ogre that was entangled had its neck snapped. The other 2 energy tentacles wrapped around the swamp lizard and wrapped around its limbs in the blink of an eye. At the same time, they wrapped around the waist of the lizard druid and lifted it up. The swamp monitor lizard let out a furious roar, but even if it had successfully passed the endurance immunity test, it could not break free from the energy tentacle's shackles. At the same time, Lizard Mandrill's neck was strangled by an energy tentacle, directly interrupting his casting process. Die. Soren's expression was ferocious. The pain brought about by the plague had completely ignited his murderous intent. The energy tentacles that he directly controlled began to tighten. The lizard man Droll let out a shrill cry as his spine and neck were snapped. His entire body was twisted into a Z-shape. An energy tentacle with 20 points of strength was enough to crush it. If there was a difference of more than 5 points of strength, the damage caused would be greatly increased. Sometimes it could even cause fatal damage. When an ordinary person with 10 strength fought against a professional boxer with 15 strength, the damage would be completely different. This was also the reason why no one could take the ogre's direct attack head-on. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Only half of the 30 seconds had passed. Before the others could react, Soren quickly controlled the energy tentacles to shoot out. One energy tentacle continued to bind the swamp monitor lizard, while the other 2 energy tentacles began to mercilessly slaughter the nearby lizard men. The energy tentacles whipped at the nearby lizardmen warriors, sending them flying 5 or 6 meters away. When they fell to the ground, their bones were broken in half. A lizardman archer wanted to take advantage of the distance between them and Soren, but the energy tentacles immediately wrapped around him and dragged him down from the 5 or 6 meter tall fence. With a bang, the lizardman archer smashed into the ground. His entire body was almost turned into a meat patty. 30 feet in length meant that the attack range was 20 meters in diameter. It was comparable to many long-range weapons. What are you waiting for? Soren let out a roar. Counterattack. Now chase them away. 30 seconds wasn't a long time, but the damage done was shocking. The ogre was killed by Soren, and the lizard man Droll was instantly killed. The nearby enemies were all cleaned up in just 15 seconds. After the death of the lizard man Droll, his animal companion, the swamp monitor lizard, began to flee. Soren attacked again and again. With the 3 energy tentacles as the center, there was not a single lizard man warrior left alive within 20 meters. The 3 energy tentacles crisscrossed and attacked. None of the lizard men present could last more than a second. Wizard! The surviving militia members cried out in fear and surprise. They then began to circle around the energy tentacles to launch a counterattack. On the other hand, the lizard men were terrified. The terrifying and unknown magic had greatly damaged their morale, especially after their leader, the Droll, was killed. Some of the nearby lizard men warriors had already fled out of fear. Spellcasters were the nightmare of all intelligent creatures. They were powerful and mysterious, and their fear of magic had long seeped into their bones. Otherwise, the monsters in the wilderness wouldn't have avoided those who obviously knew how to use magic. The situation was reversed in just 30 seconds. Soren released the shadow tentacles to kill the remaining ogre, and then killed the lizard man Droll, the Withered. More than 10 lizard men who had rushed into the village were killed in a short time. The continuous deaths of their own made them feel terrified. The wizard's terrifying power caused many lizard men to scatter. Some of them directly fled into the night. Victory? The surviving militia members murmured in disbelief. We won. The enemy ran away. The lizard men ran away. A burst of cheers sounded. Even Soren had underestimated the enemy's fear of magic. Even though the energy tentacles dissipated after 30 seconds, the fear in the hearts of the lizard men had already suppressed their desire to fight. The initial casualties had already reached 20%, but Soren's burst of power had directly raised the casualties to 40%. The death of their leader had completely destroyed their courage to continue fighting. More and more lizard men began to flee into the night. Cheers spread throughout the village. However, after the cheers there were mournful cries. The militia members looked for their loved ones with bloodshot eyes. A soldier with a broken arm endured the pain and called out the names of his wife and children with a choked voice. There were also some seriously injured people lying on the ground and wailing. Some of them couldn't be saved. Their companions held back their grief and sent them into the arms of the Grim Reaper. If they weren't given a quick death, they would even wail for an entire day before dying in endless pain. More and more cries sounded. Everyone's face was filled with sorrow because they had lost many people. Their wives, children, parents, and many familiar friends. The merciless slaughter of the lizard men had caused a lot of casualties. The death toll in the village exceeded 100 people. The fire was still burning. Some places that were completely burned could no longer be extinguished. The survivors were busy treating the wounded and trying to salvage as much as they could from the fire. The cold winter was coming, and this year's winter would be extremely difficult for them. The cries of women and children could be heard everywhere. Although the men who had experienced a difficult battle tried their best to suppress their emotions, when they saw the bodies of their children's parents, they couldn't help but cry. They even let out extremely suppressed howls like a lone wolf. A young man stood in front of the fire. He was holding the body of a young girl in his arms. She looked to be about 16 or 17 years old. She wasn't beautiful, but at most she could only be described as delicate. Her skin was slightly dark and her hands were rough. Because of long-term labor, her actual age might be younger than she looked. The young man held the body in his arms and stood there blankly. Although he didn't cry at all, one could feel his sorrow. He stood there like a fool until a house collapsed under the fire. When the others rushed over to pull him over, he seemed to have woken up and let out a desolate wail. Ah! He frantically pulled out his weapon and slashed at the body of the lizard men, causing blood and flesh to splatter everywhere. No one stopped him. Soren didn't know who the dead girl was to him. She could have been his lover or his family, but he could feel the pain in her heart. Yet there was nothing he could do. Sometimes the world was just so cruel. He had already seen too many deaths and parting. Clang. Soren looked at the body of the lizard man Droll. For the first time he didn't rush to loot. He tore a piece of cloth from his clothes and bit it in his mouth. Then with trembling hands he slowly cut off the rotten flesh and abscesses on his arm. The power of the plague spell hadn't dissipated yet. If he didn't cut off the rotten flesh and abscesses, it would continue to harm him. A suppressed howl of pain. Soren's whole body was trembling. He cut off the rotten flesh bit by bit, and applied the potion on it with a twisted expression. Chapter 66. The first rays of the morning sun shone down on the village. The entire village had turned into ruins. Although they managed to salvage a lot of things from the fire, many of the houses had been destroyed. From time to time, there were muffled sounds of sobbing. People with faces full of dust were collecting the bodies of the dead. From time to time, relatives and friends could be heard crying. This night brought them too much pain, but it also made them a lot stronger. The surviving militia looked like real warriors. They were still guarding the surroundings, guarding against a possible second attack from the lizard men. As long as they were given some time, they would grow into qualified warriors. Soren sat on the watchtower and smoked. The pipe was given to him by the militia captain. It wasn't some high-end tobacco, just a small bag of cheap shredded tobacco that cost 1 silver dural. He put the shredded tobacco into the pipe, lit it and took a deep puff. Then he looked into the distance, a little lost in thought. The cruel battle last night reminded him of the turbulent years that were about to come. In the future, such battles would be very common, and there would even be more cruel and merciless killings. His arm was still in pain. The rotten flesh that was cut off was regenerating. The combination of numbness and pain made his expression a little twisted. He trembled slightly as he took a deep puff from the pipe. There were no painkillers in this world. Although he had a digitized template, he couldn't reduce the pain. The nerves that he had trained to be very tough were not that good in front of the pain of cutting flesh. He needed to numb himself a little and temporarily forget about the wound on his arm. Here. The militia captain came over. His eyes were red as if he had cried for someone. Perhaps his family had also died last night. Humans in the wastelands were resilient, just like the men in the north. Living in a harsh environment could temper a person's will. They wouldn't fall so easily, or at least they wouldn't fall so easily. Soren shook his head and refused the liquor that was offered. He took a deep puff from the pipe and slowly said, "I don't drink." He didn't drink. Even if he was seriously injured, he didn't drink. The militia captain's arm was broken. He sat down with some difficulty and took a sip of the liquor with his good hand. Then he said, "Thank you. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have been able to survive last night." Soren didn't say anything. The militia captain reached out and took out a package. There was a clanking sound inside. It seemed to be filled with coins. He handed it over with difficulty and said in a deep voice, "I know you are an adventurer. I'm afraid that the scroll you used last night was your trump card. We've already lost too much, so we can only use this to express our sincerity. This is the white raven sword style that I obtained years ago. I've been to the battlefield in the south. Even though I only have the first half of it, it should be useful to you. The rest of the money is a token of our appreciation. Although it's not much, I hope you can accept it." Soren's arm trembled as he put down the pipe. His injuries wouldn't heal that quickly, even if he had the gift of regeneration. He picked up the book on the white raven sword style. It was a handwritten copy of the book. There were some unclear drawings on the book, but he could still roughly understand the moves. Soren pushed back the small bag of coins and took another puff from his pipe. He then slowly said, "I'll take this book, but you can keep the money for yourselves. I'm afraid you'll have a hard time this winter. If you collect some items from the lizard men, you should be able to get by." He turned around and looked at the people behind him. He picked up a withered cane and supported his body. A green leaf was swaying in the wind. He slowly said, "You better leave today. The lizard men won't give up so easily. Something big might have happened in the wilderness. Leave this place and find a place to live. As long as you're alive, there's hope for the future." Soren sighed softly. He waved the pipe in his hand, squeezed out a smile and said, "This pipe is the reward you gave me. I'm leaving now. You should make a decision soon." He left just like that. Most people didn't even notice him. Only a few people watched Soren's tired figure disappear into the distance. He was a rogue, and rogues were such a group of people. It wasn't strange for him to leave quietly like that. He didn't need flowers or thanks. He just did what he wanted to do and started the next part of his journey. Soren went back along the main road. The route was getting more and more dangerous. The lizard men had just attacked the humans near the Black Swamp before he left, but now they were approaching the outer territory of Whiterun. If the lizard men did not stop fighting for territory, a war would break out soon. Whiterun did not pay much attention to the villages in the wilderness, but if the villages that provided tax revenue to the city were attacked, the city guards and garrison troops would be dispatched to deal with them. His injuries wouldn't heal in a short time. He couldn't do any strenuous activities for at least a day or two. Soren prepared to go back along the main road. He had gained nearly 5,000 slaughter EXP from last night's battle. It was enough for him to level up as a rogue or wizard. He needed time to memorize spells. This was a relatively safe place. He wasn't interested in staying to help those people because they were just strangers. Soren didn't even know their names and they didn't know Soren's name either. They only knew that he was a rogue who could use spells. The lizard men gave a lot of slaughter EXP. The two lurkers gave nearly 1,200 slaughter EXP, the ordinary fighters gave about 200, and the ogre and drool gave Soren almost 2,000 slaughter EXP. Killing spellcasters gave more soul energy than killing spellcasters, but they were also much harder to deal with. Finally, there was the reward after the battle. You defeated the lizard men that attacked at night. After a difficult battle, your skills have improved by quite a bit. Use of magic devices +10, concentration +5, listen +5, search +3, sneak +3, dodge roll +2, dodge shift +1, negotiate +2, parry +2, heal +2, spell identification +2. You have some understanding of the ability, spell control? The improvement from this battle was very obvious. Not to mention the improvement of many basic skills, just the last ability prompt had already exceeded Soren's expectations. Ability prompt. This was the sign of mastering and training a certain ability. Under some special circumstances, you may directly get the information of a certain ability. Then, after a period of training, you can slowly master this ability. Although, spell control was only the most basic casting ability for Soren, it meant that he could save a necessary ability point. This was a great help for him to level up as a wizard, because there was no ability reward for his part-time job as a wizard. Only when he reached level 3 as a wizard would he be able to get his first ability point. Soren's strength didn't increase by much as a part-time wizard. He only got 4 rank 0 spell slots and 1 rank 1 spell slot. From now on he would get an increase in the number of spell slots for every wizard level, and at the same time he would get an extra rank 0 spell slot. High-grade wizards and warlocks had a lot of rank 0 spell slots, sometimes so many that they couldn't even use them all. However, rank 0 spells were very weak because they were called cantrips, which were considered unorthodox spells. Unless you were a talented caster like Vivian, you would rarely use rank 0 spells in a battle. There were no rank 0 spells in the spellbook. This was because wizards rarely copied down cantrips. Their spell models were relatively simple, and some of them didn't even require casting time. For example, the most commonly used Magician's Hand. That was why Soren hadn't mastered any rank 0 spells yet. He needed to go to the city spellbook shop to buy rank 0 spell copying scrolls. These scrolls were very cheap, only 1/3 of the price of a rank 1 spell. Most of them were things that only wizard apprentices would need. Soren was lucky enough to not encounter any enemies after a day of traveling. His talent of regeneration was very powerful, and he could already move his arms. However, it was still a little inconvenient for him to fight. He found an inn in the nearest town to rest. Since the roads to Whiterun were blocked, this small town that relied on trade to make a living was a little depressed. He could hear the complaints of the residents. They were all complaining about the high taxes they collected every year, and they couldn't even solve this little problem. They didn't know how long it would take. Soren entered the room that was arranged for him and told the innkeeper not to disturb him. He needed to level up as a wizard and start memorizing his first spell model. This would take a long time and he couldn't be disturbed. If he didn't tell the innkeeper in advance, who knew if the innkeeper would come knocking on his door? After all, Soren was a half-elf with 16 points of charm. Judging from his appearance, he could be considered a handsome human if it wasn't for his cold expression. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.